This is the Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate first part of what if kid Naruto was saved by Mizore and her mother. If you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And for exclusive and spicy content, follow me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. Now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
It was brighter than usual in the village. Smoke columns were rising high into the sky, and fires were raging in areas that had been cordoned off. The village was pocked by two different and distinct paths of destruction, one characterized by smoldering wood and the other by flattened buildings. For the third Hokage of the Leaf Village, however, it was a good day. His plan had been followed to the letter. But as he had done so many times before, he continued to doubt the intelligence of the villagers who comprised the Leaf. But he had never once detested the reality. Showing them what they want to see and letting them hear what they want to hear made his job easier. He had half of the civilian council enamored with him for the same reason. With the right tools and intentions, even the shinobi council could be easily influenced. His eyes narrowed as he became aware of his advisor's subtle presence, reminding him that they were the source of his annoyance when it came to politics in the Leaf. For the most part, it was just a political struggle between them and him, with his half of the council opposing the half they controlled. Since he was a shinobi himself, the majority of the shinobi council typically supported him rather than them, which was his only advantage. He had to hold back a smile at the moment because, regrettably for the child in his care, their response had been predictable. It had been more difficult than this to establish his presence in the village and its political arena. In fact, he would likely claim that the Phoenix Demon and the Kyuubi were simpler to defeat. His voice echoed throughout the village as he directed chakra to his lungs and vocal cords to intensify his voice. Konoha, we have faced a deadly foe. A foe that had threatened to destroy us. But we have prevailed, we have won, he said. His exclamation was followed by loud cries of resonant delight. As they looked up at him, their leader, the people beneath him cheered. As soon as the cheering stopped, a wave of whispers began to emerge, but the professor easily put an end to it. However, contrary to what many of you think, the demons have not been killed. The demonic fire bird is extinguished and the accursed nine-tailed fox has been weakened and trapped in a mortal form with its powers separated from it. However, it cannot be killed lest its true form re-emerge, Sarutobi warned. He held the demon in a vicious grasp, his hands painfully fisted in its blonde hair as it wailed, saying, through the work of our beloved leader, our Yondaime Hokage, it is now powerless with its power sealed within our hero here. For the demon though, it is only right for us to exact on the demon the same pain it caused us. He held their hero in his other hand. Sarutobi, the third Hokage, had no trouble carrying out his scheme to control a large number of people and condemn one to a life of hell because, in contrast to the younger ninja, he still remembered that the ninja's greatest weapon was deception rather than a showy attack method or strong weapon. It was easy for him to further solidify his own views. Ninjas can and will stop at nothing to achieve success, and shinobi and kunoichi were not honorable samurai. His goal was to establish Konoha as the strongest and transform the Phoenix Baby into their most powerful weapon. As a result of his years and decades as a shinobi, he developed a paranoia that required him to have backup plans in case the main plan failed or the demon child showed signs of betraying Konoha. Without the animosity the Phoenix Baby would encounter, the orphan possessing the Kyuubi's abilities would likewise receive training. Rather, the orphan would be brought up to despise the Phoenix Baby. Bathed in a life of privilege bestowed upon him by the village, it would guarantee that he would treasure and adore the leaf, safeguarding it at all costs. Just in case his primary strategy of using controlled kindness and suffering to create a potent weapon didn't work out. The Phoenix child had seals applied to him from the moment of his birth. The Hokage was able to limit the child's human and Phoenix abilities and knowledge by placing seals on them. They would make it possible for the Hokage, more especially, the third, to always know where the child is and, in the event that the demon ever threatened Konoha, to kill the child. In some ways, the plan was ideal, all plans were, and it ought to have given Konoha a potent weapon. Even though he was a clever and crafty man, he had made one mistake in his life and experience that would have led to his failure. He had failed to consider the possibility that demons and monsters were anything other than foolish and naive beings. After all, he was a human, and Kushina and Minato were a phoenix and its cunning human love, so it was easy for him to manipulate both of them. He laughed a little cruelly. Minato had been nothing more than an idiot. Even though he was strong, devoted, and capable of evil when necessary, he was still just a gullible youngster who was taken advantage of on the first day the shinobi professor saw him. It had only taken a few heartfelt words about the will of fire propaganda and some tugging with the village to persuade him to pretend to be the demon's lover. Getting Minato to use the Shiki Fuin, Reaper Death Seal, to make his weapon had been even simpler. To think that getting rid of his foolish fake successor was so simple that he nearly burst out laughing. He only needed to somehow omit the information that a significant number of human sacrifices were required in order to stop the Reaper from killing its user. He laughed as he peered through his crystal ball. Somehow, he had overlooked the initial attempt on the blonde weapon's life in his thoughts. Still, Sarutobi believed that everything was proceeding as planned. To get one of his Anbu to assist the poor creature, he only needed to tilt his head up a little while he was leaning back in his chair. He grinned at an Anbu member who had just lost her entire family in a Kyuubi and Phoenix attack just hours before. He took a calming breath and inserted his pipe gently into his mouth. The sheer number of idiots in his shinobi forces who didn't think was absurd, and even this simple action made him laugh. He would never be cursed by the negative effects of smoking if he applied a simple chakra to create a thin wall inside his lungs. Eventually, Hiruzen questioned whether this was the case for all sentient beings or if it was just his good fortune. She ought to have realized. They had been the closest of friends just over a year ago. Kumiko and Futuri had been equally happy that day, saying, "Hey Mizore, we're going to finish up the fort later, can you come?" Perhaps she shouldn't have declined. "Sorry, I can't, my mom wanted to teach me stitching later." Her friends gave her a quick pout, but in a matter of seconds, their beaming smiles came back. She nodded and smiled back, equally appreciative. "Then we'll save the last one for you." For almost 2 weeks, they had been constructing the fort. It had begun as something different, just a few crude walls to give them an advantage over the other kids in snowball fights, but it had gradually expanded. In the end, they had come to regard it as a second home. As they constructed the fort, they got together and played there at least 5 times a week. The sounds of them trudging through the snow had been like any other day as they turned to return home. She had been grumpy with her mother later, which was not surprising. They had intended to complete it this evening, and she had worked just as hard as Kimiko and Futuri. She did not, however, show her mother more than a little irritation, just enough to keep her out of trouble. But as an hour went by, her annoyance continued to grow. The needle was just too uncooperative. She wanted it to do something, but it wouldn't. She had sliced her unsuccessful attempt into pieces after her 12th unsuccessful attempt to replicate what her mother claimed was a simple pattern, and she later agreed. In actuality, she was too preoccupied with damning the annoying needle to hear her mother's gasp. As she sliced it with her sharp ice claws, she inevitably broke it while glaring at it with pure hatred. She had probably looked a little mystical in the evening light. Shining hands that reflected the sun's rays, snowy hair, and icy eyes. It hadn't mattered, though. Why had she been so incredibly gullible? She only had a clipped muffle of pain when she fell, her lower lip being painfully bit by teeth. Her eyes gleamed with pain, asking, why? However, she was afraid to ask her question out loud. She was already aware of the responses she would receive. Nature freak, weakling, unsightly, shameful. She tried again, though, and was pushed back just as forcefully. Salty tears welled up in her eyes, burning this time. She had only wanted to speak with them once more, Kumiko and Futuri. She turned her back on them and fled their taunts and insults. She was nevertheless aware of the looks and glares from the villagers surrounding her, and they locked onto her form as soon as they saw her running. Curiosity and anxiety can quickly give way to callousness or hateful fear. The power she detested was already beginning to materialize in the midst of everything. Crystal shards replaced the purple hair in her tresses, and ice formed where her hands had been. Her mother had claimed that it was a gift that she had developed her abilities to the point where she could perform a complete metamorphosis at such a young age. She wouldn't just beg to differ, because her mother had overlooked a piece of their village's past. The villagers were suspicious and cautious after learning about it. After all, the majority of Yuki, Ona only exhibited a slight control over it during their early years. Most only made tiny snowballs and froze water. It had never been believed that they could undergo even partial transformations where their ice claws developed. Not for their typical kids, anyway. There had only ever been one exception in their documented history. A Yuku. Ona, whose name had been removed from all tangible documentation. At the age of 10, said Yuki, Ona had demonstrated remarkable abilities, including the capacity to undergo a partial metamorphosis, the endurance to construct massive structures, and the ability to produce remarkably accurate designs. They had been amazed, particularly since, contrary to what they had previously believed, Yuki, Ona didn't really begin to develop their powers until they were 14 years old. Typically, they can undergo a partial transformation by the age of 15 and a full transformation by the age of 17. Talented individuals can undergo both transformations up to a year earlier. As a result, she was greeted with joyful smiles and well-deserved compliments from the villagers. In addition to her upbeat demeanor and warm smiles that had made them smile with the warmest of feelings, she had been such a prodigy. Then something unexpected occurred. More than 3 dozen adults and children had been killed in a single night. The manner in which they had been murdered was absolutely appalling. The less fortunate had ghoulish expressions carved into their faces. She was also discovered at the crime scene. She was sitting there looking insane, surrounded by corpses, covered in blood, and partially changed. Before they stopped attempting to subdue her, she had defeated 5 more of them. However, a naive smile had appeared on her adorable face as they abruptly changed their lethality. Her assailants had hesitated, a move that would turn out to be one of their final errors. In a split second, the madwoman's glint returned to her eyes, and all of a sudden, ice spears appeared everywhere. Over a dozen more were impaled. After slicing through her icy spear forest to return to her location, they discovered her dead body. From directly between her legs to the tip of her head, where it emerged and continued for another half-meter, she was impaled by a single ice spear. Her blood had run down the icy pole, and gray matter had hung off the ice spear. The entire village had experienced a dismal day. They had lost a lot of members, but they had also been misled into thinking that it was bad for Yuki Onna to develop her power too soon because it would make their minds unstable. What else, after all, might have been her motivation? Genius, their child, had only been 10 years old. Their belief was further solidified by the fact that they had discovered her body impaled off the ground, completely transformed with ice in place of her hair. As a result, their doubtful expressions instantly changed after they had verified her abilities. Because they believed she would be mentally unstable, they had panicked when she was as young as she had been, 6 years old at the time, even younger than their last brilliant killer. They had sent her terrified glances right away, which were soon eclipsed by hatred, given her typically quiet and reserved personality. They had demanded her death in front of her mother and herself. Their icy gazes were unaffected in the least by her terrified eyes pleading for a chance. Her life in the village had turned into a living hell after that. She kept sprinting as far as her legs would carry her past the village's perimeter. She had endured their glares and taunts for a year already. The other kids her age bullied her, and when the adults found out, the bullies were rewarded. No one in the village would have a respectable conversation with her. She was denied access to stores for even the most basic of needs. She dropped unceremoniously to the ground and turned to face the sky. It was her 7th birthday, and she had foolishly thought that today would be different. As her mother joined her in celebrating, she had made her wishful wish. She had let her mask slide a little as she considered how today would be different. Her brief display of vulnerability had been sufficient. Her heart ached. The only person who had supported her through the harsh demands and whispers was her mother. A slight, pained smile appeared as her eyes gazed thoughtfully up at the sky. She was certain that her mother and she had a stronger bond than most mother-daughter relationships in the world because she loved her mother. If it meant saving her, she thought her mother would fight the demon without hesitation, and she knew that she wouldn't either. She had sobbed like a broken wreck for countless hours in her mother's arms. Individuals she had previously considered friends had promptly abandoned her with even more callousness. She had begged and cried, but none of them had stayed her friend. Not to mention that her mother was the only person she could have a meaningful conversation with after her abilities were made public. Despite her expectation that she would give up on her, her mother persisted. She sought solace in her mother's arms once more as a result of the guilt she carried from her uncertainty. She felt sorry for herself. She has only eaten at home ever since, and for a while she only ate what her mother prepared before learning how to prepare a few basic meals on her own. She would prefer not to eat the majority of what she attempted to cook, and she was certain that no sane person would, but at this thought, her head fell in humorous dejection. Her mother once said, "What the hell?" about her inability to prepare more than 1 or 2 edible dishes. She had hardly ever heard her mother yell, much less swear, until that moment. It was probably the outcome of her cooking. A moving, rather than the condition of the kitchen, she said with a laugh. Tiny tentacles protruding from a purple glob at strange angles. It still hurt. It's true that she had her mother, and she was aware that some people were likely less fortunate than her. She received nourishment, care, and a place to live. But after spending 2 years solely with her mother, she couldn't help but long for another. Possibly a friend her own age. A parent simply couldn't assist with everything. Her eyes darkened at the idea. She muttered softly, "Yeah, right." With tears welling up at the corners of her eyes, she thought sadly that she would never make any more friends in the village. Why? Why did they act in this way every time? Naruto pondered. The boy shivered and made himself as small as possible by hugging himself. He was hiding in the small enclosed space, his tiny arms shakily wrapped around his thin legs. As they ran through the damp streets, he could hear their clogging footsteps. His hearing was deafened by the thunderous beats of the raindrops as they were halted by the cardboard above him. He shuddered at their yells, his heart leapt at their threats. and his blood ran cold at their assurances. No matter how much he begged, how much he cried, or how much he smiled, they always did this. On any other day, their icy eyes would give him the meanest glares. If they felt like it, they might occasionally break a few of his bones and give him some bruises. However, they were always overcome with rage and anger on this day, his birthday, every year as they looked for a way to let go of their feelings. He was always their solace. The first few times he saw their inexplicable fury toward him had been frightening to him, but as the years went by, the number in his head increased. As the crowd rushed past his hiding spot, he softly murmured a song that he had heard sung for other people but never for him. There was nothing else he could do to maintain a modicum of composure. The words, "Happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me, happy birthday to me, happy 8th birthday," caused his heart to hurt, but they also helped him get rid of any thoughts that were making him shake or even cry. He didn't even comprehend the two reasons he consistently survived their beatings. One was a healing factor that was absurdly quick and sophisticated, and the other he was unsure of how to describe. He always woke up, so to speak, whenever he found himself in a situation where he was likely to die. It was happening once more now. His thoughts became clearer and he became more conscious, which was likely the only reason he was thinking all of this. According to his recollections, the Hokage would always be present when he woke up in a hospital room following his capture and beating. Somehow, as if something told him not to, he couldn't bring himself to think of the apparently good man in that way. His normal self had called him Gigi out of affection. The old man consistently claimed to be the Hokage, the head of the village, but why was he unable to stop his abusers on the same day every year? However, he would never have the opportunity to think further because he would always fall back asleep gradually while his normal self came to the surface. To make matters worse, the suspicious old man would constantly tell him to forgive the villagers because they were simply grieving and misunderstood. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a horrible incident had trapped them all in their grief. Regretfully, despite the old man's constant avoidance of his inquiries regarding his parents and his beatings, his regular self always trusted him. Though never in front of the Hokage, his repressed self constantly questioned his logic. He trusted this feeling more than the senile man's broken assurances that the beatings would cease because something inside of him told him not to trust the elderly man completely. He jolted himself out of his reverie and focused on his senses. He allowed himself to relax as the final sound of their footsteps reached his ears. For the time being, he had succeeded in losing them, but the remainder of the day remained. He cautiously stuck his head out of the box. He glanced quickly in all directions, but he saw no one. He slowly crawled out after a few more suspicious minutes. He was aware of the stings right away. The rain soaked his body as it fell on him. He shuddered. The cold was the cause, not the sting from the raindrops' impact. He always detested the cold, which was more than just unpleasant to him, and he grew colder with every drop that fell on him. He quickly but stealthily ran, wrapping his arms back around himself as another shiver tore through his frail body. One of the many skills he had acquired over the years due to necessity. He found a forest he had discovered a few months prior by using his nearly flawless photographic memory, which was only accessible while he was awake. While fleeing a violent drunkard, his normal naive self had become lost in those woods. There were enormous, terrifying, and strong creatures inside that had scared him to no end. But one thing stood out to him. There weren't enough people. The creatures that had scared him had also made every effort to repel the Konoha villagers. Leaf Village. He had been hiding some food there covertly for a few weeks, whenever he had the opportunity and woke up. Now, he wanted to reach his cave. In the hopes of hiding there until the end of the day, he avoided an inebriated man by ducking into a different alley. A woman with pale brown hair in her mid-30s. One of his regular miscreants. He turned around and kept running. His legs felt like they were on fire by the time he saw those secure fences. He ducked through the narrow gap in the fence with ease, ignoring it as best he could. Ironically, it was safe and familiar territory from that point on. He eased up. He soon realized that his complacency had been a mistake when he heard something dropping behind him. He swerved around, taking in her appearance in a flash. She was dressed in an unmodest skirt, a big trench coat, and a chainmail shirt. He could see the sadness and apologies she revealed despite her guarded eyes. Perhaps she already knew what he was going to say, because he opened his mouth to ask but never got the chance. Her voice was filled with sympathy and her regret for what she was going to do was evident. "Sorry, but it's either you or me, and as much as I'm sorry for you, I'll have to do what those old bastards on the council told me to do." She was failing at hardening her face, and he could see it. He saw a single tear trickle from her face before the darkness obscured his vision. "Why?" was Naruto's final thought before he vanished from consciousness. He felt disengaged. It was strange to him, but it felt good nonetheless. In the deserted world he found himself in, a slight throbbing reverberated. But before he could fully comprehend, a streak of pain shot through his thigh, dragging him painfully back to the cruel waking world. He looked around, blinking wildly, and before he knew it, a sense of dread had taken hold of him. They had apprehended him. His arms burned as they struggled to keep him away from the pole, and he felt for the rest of his body. Then he noticed the excruciating burning and itching sensation where a blade with its wider side facing down had stuck his palms together. With the exception of the wooden stick that protruded awkwardly from his right thigh, his legs were kept off the ground. For the time being, everything else felt right. They carried a variety of weapons, from dull to shiny, long to short, blunt to sharp, and their loud chanting pounded against his ears. He wanted to give up, just let go, and forget about the suffering, pain, and misery that had been his life. But he refrained from doing so for some reason. A blunt, hollow metal pole that was mercilessly twisted slowly infiltrated one of his eye sockets, increasing his desperation and desire to just give up. He couldn't, though, because something inside of him told him he couldn't give up and wouldn't want to. However, he was aware that the worst was still to come because this was not the first time he had experienced such torture. More eyes had grown back into his body than he had been alive. He didn't scream as the serrated knife was slowly and painfully dragged across his body. His teeth gripped his lips until they turned scarlet. He had experienced enough agony to realize that there was nothing he could do to ease it. He could only divert his attention from it. So, he reasoned. As another knife was viciously thrust into his stomach, he wished for a better day. It only momentarily shook his fictitious thoughts as it was twisted in vicious circles. It helped even though he was still able to see, hear, and feel. He was abruptly brought back to reality when his only working eye spotted a circle of ninja surrounding him, all dressed in the gray and black uniform of Konoha Anbu. Had the elderly Hokage been telling the truth now? Was he genuinely attempting to keep him safe? Incredulously, Naruto inquired. Because they were afraid of these elite ninja who only reported to the Hokage, the crowd surrounding him cautiously retreated. Despite his initial optimistic thoughts, his lone eye hardened as something inside of him screamed. Lies. They believed the ninja were there to arrest them and save the monster brat. When they all turned to face him and made familiar gestures with their hands, he wasn't surprised. The mob's applause was rekindled when they saw their ninja rid their village of demonic filth, specifically the child in the middle of them. A child with red life all over his body, a nearly spilling torso, and a ruined eye socket. Together, they sped through hand, seals, and when they came to a halt, they all did so precisely and simultaneously. Kaiten. Gokaku no Jutsu, Fire Style, Fireball Jutsu, exclaimed the Anbu squad collectively. The loud cries for his death from the crowd were the only sound that could match the roar of the escalating flames. Squeezing his eyes shut, Naruto waited. Before long, the rain did nothing to lessen the balls of fire, and he felt the heat from the flames brush against him. He heard sizzling noises as his clothes began to burn, and he was certain he would soon follow. To his surprise and cautious relief, he never experienced the pain, even though he was certain that he had already been engulfed and that flames had embraced him. Perhaps he had died instantly? Had he passed away already? Does it feel like this to be dead? He asked himself in his head. His body felt weightless, and his vision was white. He just allowed himself to float in the emptiness. Abruptly, a sensation appeared, radiating from his skin inward. A sensation of warmth, strength, and security permeated his body. His senses were heightened and his mind sharpened as it flooded his body. But his senses were screaming bloody murder as he felt sharp pains from his damaged eye, neck, above his heart, and from most of his torso. Before he knew it, his obstinate lips had torn a scream of pain from his throat. Something that had never been meant to be locked felt like it was being violently undone. The warm sensation returned in a matter of seconds after the pain subsided. His entire being, including his body, was changing. His personality and thoughts began to change, and strangely, it felt right. He saw his usual, happy, go, lucky self disappear in his imagination. It was replaced by a glittering, black, grayish orb that drew his hand. Unable to comprehend why he had suddenly embraced it with all of his being, he reached out with one hand. After a few brief pulses, it began to seep into him. As he gained knowledge of so many things and recollections of so many unfilled parts of his life, he felt changes erupting all over his body the entire time. He heard a slight click in his head, and then he felt as though he had just let go of everything, and it felt natural. As power surged from deep within him, he felt it pulse and change as it was released, burning his veins like liquid fire. He pushed and struggled with a sense of power, his own power. He allowed it to push and flow freely. Before a single completing sensation overtook him, it forced itself outward, and the last sound he heard was the mixed screams of innumerable people. Beyond the boundaries of the elemental nations and into other dimensions with even the faintest hint of connection to this one, the massive pulse of power erupted. He was floating in a weightless world when he heard the faint words, "Wake up." The world just shook when it happened again. Wake up. This time, his world broke apart and he opened his eyes to see a different world. Some white dots flew past him quickly, while others flew slowly. The world was blanketed in white, which was even more unexpected. He only had a few more seconds before his world changed again and he was overcome by the strange feeling that something was pulling at his consciousness. The location he was in this time was damp and dark. He pulled himself out of the ankle-deep water and looked around. Was I thrown into a sewer once more? That was the first thing that came to mind, but he quickly realized that he was still awake. His recollections of the recent past rushed back to him. He looked at his own body and asked out loud, "What happened?" He freely tested his own body by experimentally squeezing his own hand. He took a deep breath, held it, and then let it out all at once. Not only did his body feel different, but his mind did as well. At the same time, he was absorbing a lot of details and analyzing every bit of information. It was almost unreal. His eyes had noticed the pipe above, which gave off a faint red glow. Even though everything appeared to be a typical sewer, it beat. He gave a blink. Am I dreaming? It pulsed once more, but it seemed to be slower this time. He blinked once more. The portion of the pipe directly above him then started to glow more intensely before the glow started to slow down as it moved forward. Then it returned to him once more before moving in the same way. Is it requesting that I follow? He regarded it suspiciously. Normally, he would have just followed it, but this time, he wasn't asleep and wasn't imprisoned by his typical ignorant self. However, something was off. He was unable to explain why, but his mind didn't feel the same as usual. Actually, the strange feeling that things were falling into place was the closest he could come to explaining it. Perhaps that's why I've become so perceptive lately. He eventually decided that he would follow the light, if only to see where it would take him, since he could think of nothing else to do but get lost in the undoubtedly winding tunnels. He was guided around a few corners, but he was able to maintain a mental lock on his location with ease because he had created a mental map that grew as he went. He soon discovered his destination when an exit became visible. A sense of power seeped toward him as light streamed through to him from behind it. Above him, the glow rushed toward the door and vanished into the light curtain. He followed warily. He quickly observed that his eyes had strangely adapted to the brightness almost immediately. As soon as the details became apparent to him, he began to discern them. It was very clear that the large metal cage occupied the majority of the spacious room. He was intrigued by its height because he was unable to see the ceiling. But the big cage caught his attention more. What creature, after all, would need a cage big enough to contain a mountain? The moment a massive snout emerged from the darkness that covered the cave's rear, his query was promptly addressed. However, Naruto remained silent as his thoughts connected a number of dots to questions he had always wanted the answers to. He hardly noticed that there was a Biju in front of him. But being ignored didn't sit well with the older creature. With an earth-shattering growl, he caused the water to violently ripple. He was able to quickly capture Naruto's attention. I didn't bring you here to daydream. Was all he could say, his mind jumbled. Have you figured out why they hate you now? With a hint of irritation, Naruto looked up at the fox and let his arms drop. Yes. He had no idea why, but he was experiencing a completely strange emotion. It gave him the urge to kill someone or destroy something. What's this feeling? It's overwhelming, making my thoughts cloudy. I feel this urge to make someone suffer. He began in a normal tone before lowering it to a whisper and finishing with a sharp exhale. The boy caused the Kyuubi's eyes to narrow. It's rage. Naruto looked at the fox and said, "Rage." His confused and calculating eyes nearly made the fox shudder. You had seals placed on you as a baby. They were designed to keep you stupid and loyal to that village of meatbags. One of those ways by which it did it was to seal off any rage or anger you could have felt against them. The fox sneered at the conclusion, demanding to kill any humans who dared to do such things out of his own rage. Those seals had also made your mind weak and underdeveloped, such that when you started developing a mask to hide from all the abuse you suffered daily, it blurred into your real personality and sent your real mind into a dormant state. Naruto's gaze widened. Naruto thought, that explains so much. His brief moments of insight when he was in grave danger. At that moment, he saw his normal self disappearing and felt a wave of correctness wash over him. He had never experienced anger himself, but he had witnessed others' faces turn red with it. As Kyuubi prepared for the explosion, his eyes widened slightly. The boy's intensity of rage was almost equal to his own on his worst days. It appears that my senses were correct. Not at all. Since they hadn't existed for ages, Kyubi had been dubious when he had sensed their presence. However, the boy's emotional outburst was accompanied by the clear presence of an ancient energy rather than the pure emotion itself. The boy in front of him exuded a similar kind of power, and the sheer power they had wielded, even if only in his memories, was enough to make him shudder. His voice reverberated off the surrounding walls as he said, "Don't let it control you, hatchling." It was impossible, so Naruto didn't listen. He had never experienced anger of any kind before, and it was so overwhelming that it choked his logical thoughts and made his fists so tight they could draw blood. Kyubi sent a wave of water at the boy with a tail swipe, who, wallowing in his terror, did not see the wave coming. "Hey," he responded indignantly, but as he concentrated on the fox that had soaked him, his anger was literally washed away. However, he appeared to realize what he had been doing the moment his gaze locked with the fox's. "Sorry." That caused the Kyubi to recoil in shock, regardless of the situation. Despite the fact that this jailer wasn't particularly human, it was the first time he had ever received an apology from a jailer. All of his previous hosts were more than willing to point the finger at him for everything. He would respond to the single question, "Do you blame me for how your childhood has been?" Naruto appeared to consider the enormous red fox for a brief period of time. He would not be any different from his normal self if he had said that the Kyubi was to blame for everything. Unless you attacked for no reason at all or a really stupid one, no, it wouldn't be fair to blame you for what they choose to do. The fox was able to exhale in relief as a result. A faint hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. As he moved, his form was suddenly enveloped in a bright light. Before long, he was able to walk. A man with red hair tied in a single ponytail passed through the cage's bars and said, "My name is Kurama, and we have a lot to talk about Naruto." He wore a loose fitting shirt and army pants, and his 9 tails flowed majestically behind him. A brown hilted sword was at his waist, and a band with an old-fashioned image of a phoenix against a whirlpool backdrop was fastened around his left wrist. He automatically responded when he sensed his jailer's question. "This is my preferred form, and as for those bars, they will let me through as long as they don't sense any ill intent from me that is directed toward you." Kurama's muscles moved gracefully with his body, giving the impression that it was carved out of marble. Although he gave off an air of nobility, there was a hint of a seasoned killer who had seen too much. A loud shaking ripped through the sewer as Kurama got to the boy. He swore. The sudden fall of the boy in front of him only made it worse. Before the boy could run back into his cage, he rushed forward and caught him. He had some power in his cage. He pictured a plain bed and laid Naruto on it. He put his hand over Naruto's forehead next to him. After concentrating his energy on his hand, Kurama created a link in a split second. He opened his eyes. He assessed his condition right away. Kurama could see why the boy had passed out because everything was covered in snow except for his head. He unleashed a burst of fire that melted the snow, using as much Yuki as he could safely channel. He did everything he could to keep the boy from becoming hypothermic, even though it had the unfavorable side effect of burning his host's clothing. He kept the boy's limbs functional and heated his vital organs by swirling tiny amounts of Yuki inside his body. The body was then feebly pulled to its feet by him. He landed in a frozen wasteland of all places, so it was a miracle he survived that long. He looked around, but all he could see was snow in every direction for as far as his eyes could see. I guess even this lucky bastard's luck can run out sometimes. He began his ancient duty to keep the boy alive, noting that he was on a mountain. Even though it was difficult to spread his senses as much as he could given the weak body he was using, he was still able to identify 2 nearby signatures that were close to one another. He immediately turned to face them. That was all he had at the time, and his ability to sense negative emotions made it easy for him to know that those 2 wouldn't hurt without cause. He cursed once more within 10 minutes of ascending the mountain. It was annoying that the pain and exhaustion had chosen to accompany him when he had connected to his host's body to guide it. Even worse, he hadn't experienced fatigue from walking since he was 7 years old. He growled in frustration and thrust forward. A little more. He was having trouble breathing because the body he was using was beginning to fail him. Every step he took seemed to deplete all of his energy, and his limbs felt like they were made of lead. He could only force so much Yuki through the seal before the limiter took over. Kyubi sent out his final attempt to save the boy, hoping that they would find him. He shot it out of the boy's mouth, gathering as much Yuki as he could without hurting his host. Before a line of red-hot energy shot out from the Yuki ball toward the direction of the 2 he had sensed, the ball shot straight up into the sky. The unconscious body of Naruto lay beneath the red orb. Sitting on a plain blue mat, Surara and Mizore Shirayuki ate shaved ice slowly. They relished their solitude as they silently observed the horizon. The village they lived in was perched atop one of the mountains that formed a beautiful landscape in front of them. They were on a mountain, close to its summit, on a broad stretch of flat terrain. They both wore plain white kimonos despite the snow-covered mountain. A violet obiage, 2, a Byzantium, 1, obi, 3, and an indigo obi. Jaime, 4, held Sorera's kimono, which featured a violet-blue line through the collar, together. The red-violet collar of Mizore's knee-length kimono was held together by a simple obi of the same color. As they allowed the calm and peace to soothe them, they embraced the cold. They liked that no one else knew about their hidden location. In other words, Mizore was to blame. Sorera knew she was always more at ease here than in her room, their home, or, regrettably, their village. Even though she never spoke to her mother, it's definitely not their village. The fact that her daughter harbored some animosity and hatred toward the village saddened her, but she understood why. In the village, Mizore had no friends her own age, and even some adults were suspicious of her. There was only so much she could do when even the adults in the village rejected her daughter for developing her skills much earlier than they typically do, and even less when they told their kids to avoid her. If Mizore's distinct personality had been the only reason, she might have had an easier time assisting her daughter. As one of the village's more powerful residents, they did respect her, but when it came to her daughter, things were very different. If she hadn't witnessed it firsthand, she wouldn't even have thought that people could behave in such radically different ways. Her concern for her daughter's future, particularly when Mizore reached adulthood, caused her to repress a tiny frown. A line of brilliant red Yuki appeared in the sky in front of them, blinding her senses as her senses suddenly flared at her. For a few seconds, it just hung in the sky as a red line that nearly appeared solid before abruptly stopping. The end of the line abruptly burst as she hurried Mizore to her feet. She grabbed her kimono sleeve and wrapped it around Mizore while she squeezed her eyes shut. However, the pain never materialized. From inside the folds of her kimono, Mizore's voice was muffled and tinged with concern. "Haha, mother, what are you doing?" she said. She turned to face the strangeness that pervaded the air as she slowly unwrapped herself. Auxilium, Hilf, Bantuan, and Ju Ming were just a handful of the hundreds of symbols that she had never seen before. Eventually, as she looked through them, her gaze fell on one that she knew. 7. "Help," she muttered to herself. It seems that the person who sent this was requesting assistance. Her bright blue eyes stared curiously at Mizore and the words spelled in the sky as she gently patted her daughter on the head to help her relax. She pulsed her Yuki outward to calm herself. Eventually, she reached the end of the line that blazed like a constant bolt of lightning on her senses. She picked up a tiny blip that was rapidly disappearing as she sharpened her senses to concentrate on other senses in the area. The amount of control required to maintain such a thing was absurd, so she didn't give it much thought and agreed to assist whoever had requested it, even if it was just to determine what could have sent such a focused line of Yuki. The line had not vanished even now. Her daughter's eyes glinted curiously as she said, "Looks like we're going on a rescue mission, Mizore. Pay close attention to how I handle it, okay, dear?" The words were held in the sky. She made a snow sled with her daughter and smiled softly as she raised her up. She climbed on and put her daughter down. "Hold very tightly, Masumi, daughter." Normally she wouldn't try to go ask as quickly as possible, but she only had a few minutes because the signature she had locked onto was fading. She sank her control over the snow and ice into their surroundings with intense concentration. Mizore's eyes grew wide as she realized how much power her mother was going to use. She entered a partial transformation and secured herself by sinking her ice claws into the sled. And just in time. Sorera gave the snow sled a strong tug that sent it hurtling down the hill. Mizore had anticipated a crazy woman desperately attempting to control the craft, but she was left speechless when she saw her mother move with the same grace as always. As the craft continued to gain speed, her mother's hands swayed from front to back and side to side in a beautiful dance. They covered enough ground in less than a minute for Sorera to mentally observe that she had doubled her own speed record. When the target was only 100 meters away, Mizore tightened her hold on the snow surrounding them. Suddenly, her mother's hand stiffened and twisted, jerking Mizore roughly. In 3 seconds, their craft skidded to a halt. Sorera used a sophisticated tactic to make the snow bend in a circle around them, keeping the glaring blizzard away from the area. She wouldn't be able to continue it for very long because it was exhausting. She slid off her sled and got closer to what her senses had focused on 5 minutes before. Above them, the red line is still visible. Strangely enough, the line vanished as soon as she could see the boy's body. She knelt next to the boy, who was partially buried in the snow, and decided to ask that later. As she felt the boy's energy signature, a slight frown crept onto her face. Fire. Her icy powers could clearly see the heat of the boy's power. She couldn't understand it. How a fire yokai monster had managed to get this far into the mountain range was beyond her comprehension. Had they not been shielded from the weather, every fire yokai she knew would have perished in the cold. Her daughter, on the other hand, reacted differently when she saw the boy, whom she recognized right away as someone who wasn't from her chilly village. Mizore's face flushed as she realized the boy was naked. Considering that this was the first time she had ever seen a boy in the nude, let alone one her own age, curiosity was a strong motivator, but it was nothing compared to the hope that had grown inside of her. He wasn't from her village, so he wouldn't be aware of her abilities. He wouldn't need to be afraid of her. She would be able to make friends at last. She lifted one of the boy's arms and gave the other to her daughter, who had been staring at him with a detached expression. "Help me with him, Masumi." But she ignored that, noting in her mind that the boy's skin was warmer than a human's. Given how he had managed to create such a strong line of Yuki, she gave herself a mental slap for her momentary foolishness. Mizore tentatively grabbed his arm and slung it over her shoulder. They lifted the boy onto the sled together, but within a minute of the boy being put on it, Surara was shocked to see a hole in the shape of the boy. However, her daughter swiftly lifted the boy back up, and since they were only 8 years old, it was quite the sight as she battled to support the boy's weight. Instead, Surara was trying to better read the boy's energy signature by concentrating her senses on him. He had so little energy, just slivers of it, that it shouldn't have mattered that it felt weak and that there was a hint of fire. She narrowed her eyes at him because it was the first time she had ever witnessed someone passively melt her ice, and since she usually built her sleds out of ice that was dense enough to survive a head-on collision with a boulder, it didn't make sense to her. It made even less sense as she glanced at her daughter, who showed no indication that the boy was too hot, especially since she had successfully placed him on her back. She put her hand on the sled's edge and concentrated, deciding to consider all of these things later. The hole was repaired in a matter of seconds, and she strengthened the sled by compressing as much ice as she could while keeping the blizzard from encircling them. She sighed and motioned for her daughter to return to the sled. As she watched her daughter clumsily attempt to get herself and him onto the sled, she couldn't help but laugh softly and muffledly. When she slipped, her daughter's face would contort to show annoyance, but when she managed to get the two of them onto the sled, it finally showed satisfaction and accomplishment. In the strange scene, her daughter seemed to fit right in. She began to feel hopeful that this boy might be able to provide her daughter with what the village was unable to. What was once a third of Konoha was circled by two small red birds. They were anything but typical birds. They were both extremely powerful, perhaps more powerful than all the ninjas in the shinobi world put together. The crater was enormous, extending down at least 10 meters. There was Konoha on one side of the crater and forest on the other. It appears that the Hokage Tower was only 5 meters from the crater's edge. However, it seemed that the village had built a stone wall to create a temporary perimeter for what remained of the village. After surveying their surroundings, they gradually approached the explosion's center, where the strongest residual energy was found. Even though most people would be disturbed by the energy signatures coming from the region, there were benefits to being just over 1.8 thousand years old, like having a wealth of knowledge that made it easy to identify what was happening. One of the creatures wearing a bird's disguise thought analytically, this energy is similar yet different at the same time. They saw indications that a dimensional rift had formed there and came to the conclusion, looks like the huge release of energy also ripped a hole between two dimensions. I can feel the distorted nature energy. They took off after learning the signature of the residual energy, to a place where what they were going to try would be safer. The two birds fired into a tiny sliver that glinted in the sky. They were in their humanoid forms back at home, putting in place a lot of switches and seals. They descended to the lowest level and found themselves in a plain-looking room. However, a closer look would reveal invisible seals on the room's walls, strengthening the space beyond what could be achieved with just materials. However, they visited another room, which was similarly reinforced, before they began. They looked longingly together. After saying, "We'll be back soon, Masumi," they departed the room where their daughter, an egg, was kept. She wouldn't be reborn for a few more years, and this would be the first time they had abandoned her in a long time. They then went inside and closed off the room where they planned to create a stable dimensional rift. The seals performed their duty and contained the enormous energy surge that flooded the room. They lit up a dull green, suggesting that they were hardly strained. Before long, a wooden door framed a stable rift in front of them. The door shut behind them as they stepped into the rift. Two ancient beings with long, forgotten power entered the dimension on a snow-capped mountain. As snow battered their shapes, a faint yellow radiance enveloped them. However, none made contact with them since each ice crystal vanished as soon as it came within a centimeter of them. As a chill went through his body, Kazushi muttered, "Never liked cold places much." Miyuki found his complaining amusing, and he heard a quiet giggle next to him. In order to obtain some respite from the cold, Kazushi increased his power output and temporarily extended his fiery aura a few meters. He knew full well that they were on the side of a mountain and that if he did anything more, the remaining snow above them would probably fall. In addition, although he could avoid the snow, he wasn't certain he could avoid his wife's wrath. Miyuki raised an eyebrow and spread his senses, saying, "Quite the party here in this world." The air itself contained a far higher mix of yuki than most worlds, and he discovered a barrier that concealed many yukai within. However, it was the trace remnants of a bijuu's energy that truly caught his attention. That was very strange because, despite their strength, Bijuu always had trouble traveling between worlds because their energies tended to confine them to Makai and a few particular worlds. There were no natural Bijuus in the world they were in, as he recalled. Something wasn't right unless one appeared out of nowhere in the previous few decades. His voice took on a hint of seriousness. Miyuki was halfway through her transformation when she angled her flight path to reach a nearby human settlement. "We had better find whoever gave out that energy quickly. If he or she is one of us, this weather will be rather troublesome. Not to mention all the other yukai this world houses." Since the energy signature of any being capable of releasing so much that they felt it across worlds didn't simply vanish, they were already operating under the presumption that whoever they were looking for was in trouble. Their bodies should have been able to track the energy more easily because it had felt so similar to their own. The only plausible explanation for their inability to find anything at all was that whoever it was in serious trouble. One red bird in the sky divided into 2, then 4, then 8, and so on, until there were hundreds of them. Miyuki's fire clones flew in all directions, each going to a different settlement. They were designed with the specific commands: search and recover. After 3 days, they were to return to their starting point and disperse if they found nothing. The other portion of the search was Kazushi's. He produced hundreds of fire clones with similar commands to Miyuki's in a moment of concentration. They searched the ground through the blinding blizzard, splitting up in all directions in a matter of seconds. "What happened?" he asked in a strained voice. He pushed himself awkwardly up into a sitting position and then swung his head to the left and right in an attempt to locate himself. His memories came flooding back to him in a jumble for the second time that day. "Kurama," was the first thing he said when his more recent memories came back to him. As he occasionally sipped tea from a plain cup in his hands, the Bijuu remarked, "You fainted, quite impressive actually. Most people would never reach a point where even their mental consciousness falls unconscious. Their body usually collapses before then." Kurama sat with his legs folded across the floor. Since this wasn't exactly a normal situation, he was still a little cautious. "Thanks." He drained the remaining liquid from his cup and placed it by his side, saying, "Now then, seeing as you're awake, I'll continue where I left off. You, as you would probably have already figured out by now, aren't exactly normal, though it helps more often than not." Naruto nodded feebly because he was still trying to make sense of everything and his mind was still a little cluttered. It was made more difficult by the fact that even his own thoughts were shifting. His way of thinking was evolving. But if he put in the effort, he could follow, to a certain extent. "You are what is known as a phoenix. A phoenix is a legendary immortal bird of fire. Phoenixes possess immense power, so immense that every Bijuu combined would still pale in comparison to the most powerful of phoenixes, though few ever got to that point. With enough control and skill, a phoenix can make the literal incineration of a whole world child's play." Kurama continued in a neutral voice. Naruto, who attempted to sense the new, unfamiliar, yet familiar power in his body, was also taken aback by that. He hardly felt anything. Something Kurama noticed with ease. Even though Naruto didn't react the way he usually did, he was calmer and more reflective now that he was in charge and aware of his thoughts and actions. Kurama noticed a subtle shift in the boy's mental walls and said, "Remember, your phoenix heritage was suppressed from birth by seals put on you. It's expected that you don't have much control over it yet." His eyes grew wide as he thought back to their initial conversation. He became fully aware of what Kurama also hinted at. He clenched his fists without realizing it. Naruto was unaware of the brief shimmering of his mindscape's walls, but Kurama was. He started to ask, but Kurama's glance caused his mouth to close. "It looks like you'll be waking up soon though, so I'll skip to the relevant part first. When those ninja shot those fireballs at you, your body naturally absorbed the energy in them and used it to break the seals placed on you. Your release of suppressed energy since your birth caused a dimensional rift that tore you from your world and into another. So when you wake up, don't be too surprised if things are too different." He nodded and mentally prepared himself. When Kurama stopped saying, "Also," Naruto gave him a curious glance, but he only pointed. Naruto freaked out the moment he saw his own body. When one of Kurama's tails slapped him across the face, he instantly became alert. Am I dying? The boy would be a pain for at least a month while his mind reintegrated, the fox sighed. The last thing he heard from the fox before he abruptly found himself in a new setting again was, "You're just waking up. I'll explain the rest when you sleep, as I'll be able to drag you back here." He had spent the majority of his life pretending to be a happy, gullible fool whose growth was stunted, but after enough traumatic events, even though he was unable to adapt, his body did. His trained instincts were only strengthened by the revelation of his repressed memories and experiences. His breathing did not alter, his muscles did not twitch, and he awoke silently. He made an automatic note of the locations of every part of his body while keeping his eyes closed. He strained to hear what might be in the room. "One," he said, counting just one person, even though his body scan had already revealed that he was unarmed, wearing strange clothing, and unrestrained. He cursed, but not because his old clothes were gone. That had happened to him many times before. He cursed because the inflated prices that were specially made for him in his village meant that he would have to pay a lot of money to get replacements for his clothes and equipment, no matter how bad they were. But as soon as he felt a cool, gentle touch on his forehead, his mental preparations for an escape came to an abrupt stop. Before that, he thought he felt a blanket being smoothed over him. None of his kidnappings had ever been like this. But when Kurama's warning replayed itself in his mind, his shock was minimal. In light of this, he chose to merely act out a sleep-induced arousal. He opened his eyes slowly, as though he had just woken up. He saw a pair of blue eyes as he moved to lock onto the person he had heard. The girl jumped back a little when she realized he was staring, and then her lips slowly moved into a tentative but gentle smile. He noticed signs of doubt and anxiety in her blue eyes, which made him wonder if this was just another ruse. But as his thoughts paused for a few seconds, her face, framed by her purple hair, seemed to overshadow that. With her as its sole focus, his eyes, still getting used to the light, had blurred the rest of the world. His lips moved unconsciously to say, "One world." Tenshi, Angel. She appeared to gaze in astonished surprise for a moment before her face quickly turned red and she turned away from him. It took him several long, awkward seconds to realize what had happened. He just chose to blame his still adjusting body and mind. He straightened up and turned to face the girl, saying, "Sorry if I surprised you, I was a bit startled." The damp towel dropped into his hands from his head. He nearly missed the whisper, but it still registered as true. "It's fine." Her gaze was fixed on her hands as she played with them rather than meeting his. Her mind raced with anxious ideas. Her mind was filled with ideas, plans, and thoughts as she agonizedly contemplated her options. "So, my name is Naruto Uzumaki." He was unsure of what to do because, as it turned out, neither he nor Mizore had many pleasant social experiences with people her own age. She took longer than usual to respond, as if his introduction had frozen her thoughts. Mizore Shirayuki was a whisper once more. The boy before her was an opportunity. An opportunity to meet someone and rediscover the life she had known before her abilities evolved. Even if it was only until he eventually learned about it and became afraid of her. "No, he won't find out," she thought. "I refuse to let him." She barely restrained herself from shaking her head as she yelled in her own head. He couldn't help but display some of his old habits when he saw how her attention was almost entirely focused on her now quickly twisting fingers. They were undoubtedly done enough times to stick, even if they had been fake. As he tried to see how far he could go without her noticing, a cunning smile played across his face. Little by little, his head crept forward. By the time his mouth was almost at her ear, he was certain that she would not likely notice him if he left. He controlled his breathing, allowed a smile to appear, and then gave a brief but startling greeting. "Hello." He managed to contain his laughter, but he couldn't help but smile when she practically leapt into her kneeling position and turned to face him. Before she knew it, she had fallen onto the futon with a clipped yelp next to the blonde, who had just managed to shift swiftly enough to avoid colliding with her as she turned her legs crisscrossing with one another. Her eyes were fixed on his smirking face as she tried to slow her frantic breathing. She had been rudely interrupted, and all of the thoughts she had previously fabricated were now lost to her, scattered in the wind. However, any anger that might have developed vanished when her lips met his and she let out a quiet giggle. She didn't really know why, just that she probably did look pretty funny in a way. Her laugh broke the proverbial dam, causing Naruto to let out a few giggles. Before long, their laughter only inspired one another to laugh even harder. Surara, who was going to get her daughter dinner, stopped outside the door as their laughter drifted out of the room. Her brow furrowed as she paused. She walked into the room as the door's latch clicked audibly. She was greeted with flushed faces, as though the two kids in the room had just been caught like deer in a headlight, and the laughter abruptly stopped, much to her amusement. Hi. I'm Naruto Uzumaki," he said, fighting the awkwardness that had enveloped them. For a few seconds, Surara fixed the blonde with a critical gaze before allowing a soft smile to appear on her face. She pointed a hand at her daughter to indicate, "I'm Surara Shirayuki, Mizore's mother." Deeply ingrained instincts, however, forced her to replay the events in her mind. What had become of her daughter's non-existent social skills? Even though his mind had been screaming at him just a minute before, he asked, Anyo, Surara.san, do you know what happened?" He nearly leapt out of the futon when Surara leveled her shielded eyes on him, thinking her analysis was a chilly glare. Surara offered instead, recalling her original plan. "If you're fine, why don't you come down with us for dinner? I'll tell you what I know over it." He was compelled by ingrained instincts to look for any hidden agendas, and he did so to some extent. However, he didn't put as much effort into it as he usually did. This could be because he was emotionally starved, because Mizore had already influenced his choices, or because his mindset was currently shifting, but in any case, he found himself unconcerned. He put himself on his feet and grinned, saying, "Sure." However, Surara noticed that some of the smile appeared to be forced. Abruptly, some of the incidents he had previously seen entered his consciousness. Naruto only knew that he had witnessed others do it. He didn't see many of its nuances. Given the potential risks, he made the decision to give it a try. He turned back to Mizore and unexpectedly extended his hand with a loose wrist. Mizore halted her own attempt to get to her feet before it started, and for a brief moment, she was confused as she stared at the offered hand. To Surara's secret astonishment, she smiled childishly and delicately put her hand in his, and with a powerful pull, she was raised to her feet. However, Naruto had noticed her strange reactions and had nearly withdrew his hand, believing he had done something incorrectly. His mind was still wondering about her response, even though a smile had been on his face when she took his hand. But a sharp growl forced him to put his thoughts on hold for now. His other hand rubbed the back of his neck as he glanced at Surara, blushing slightly. With a smile that had a hint of teasing, she stepped aside and pointed at the door, saying, "The food is still waiting." Hi, was Naruto's response. He followed Surara out as she showed him around her house, with Mizore passing right by. Surara turned to them as they came to another door, this one directly to the right of the stairs they had come down. "Why don't you go ahead first, Mizore? I want to check on something with Naruto first." Mizore glanced at Naruto and then back at her mother, her eyes seemingly wary but curious. Would her mother? She wouldn't refuse her this opportunity, would she? Would she? Mizore questioned herself unsurely. Throughout her life, her mother had always been there for her, doing her best to support her as a mother. Her mother didn't care if it was forced or fake because she knew she desperately needed a friend. She felt as though she was going insane because she had been socially isolated from everyone but her mother for such a long time. However, Mizore's eyes grew a little wider. What if she knew? What if? Mizore stopped herself there, reacting instinctively due to her mother's stalker training because she was taking too long to respond. She said, "You won't take long," a little louder than she had been when she spoke to Naruto earlier, but still soft enough that he would have to listen closely. Her mother had sensed the tiniest hint of poison in her voice. Surara filed her daughter's response for later, raising an eyebrow subtly. "Of course." She closed the door between them and waved her away while grinning reassuringly. He trudged warily after her, a seed of doubt gnawing at him. "Follow me." When they turned in the middle of the hallway, Surara paused to look at him. She owed it to the village to at least examine him. In an instant, she had decided to bring him into their village as an outsider and possible danger. Instead, she could have chosen to take him to her ski resort, but it was too far away, and she couldn't be sure he would make it. She looked cool and collected now, as if the gentleness had all been a lie. His body cried out for him to fight or flee, and his own eyes narrowed. He resisted his instincts and stood his ground. As of yet, he had no evidence that she would do anything harmful. It was all a lie. The terrified part of his mind yelled at him with all its might. However, he had truly felt happy during that fleeting moment of happiness he had shared with Mizore. After years of suffering, he decided to give them the benefit of the doubt, denying the instincts that had been ingrained in him. Surara observed his stance and evaluated all she had seen of the boy so far. Nothing at all matched what a strong Yukai would wear. The boy was either incredibly talented at acting, or, she couldn't tell why, but her eyes suddenly flashed a picture of her daughter. The question was direct and to the point. "Do you remember anything at all about what happened?" Furthermore, it was more of a gambit than a potentially hazardous gamble. Naruto was taken aback since he had only anticipated less enjoyable outcomes. "No, not really," he said, scowling slightly as he gestured to the area beneath her eyes. He appeared to be looking for a road sign or something similar when he said, Not how I ended where I did or here. One of the more difficult things to do was to deceive Yuki, Ona. For almost any race, it would be impossible to escape completely unnoticed. As a race that frequently engaged in combat for males, it was not strange that the women had mastered the art of stalking and spying. After all, finding a partner was one thing, but maintaining one was quite another, particularly when they were gradually integrated into the village and occasionally even abducted human men they were certain would not be missed. Many of them had attempted escape in the past, so they were closely monitored and cared for. While some went crazy, others did eventually fall in love with their Yuki, Ona developers. But right now, she had a lot of flags flying high in her head. She squinted at the boy, examining each and every detail. From the tone of his voice to his posture. Though nothing he had said had been false, she could sense that he was keeping something from her. She met his blue eyes with her own, but as she did so, something else happened to her. Even the majority of Yuki. Ona wouldn't be able to see through his mask, which was extremely dim and held as a veil so thick yet nearly real. Heck, the boy's aura was so familiar that it was probably the only reason she had seen it at all. She had an unpleasant encounter with these masks, perfect masks. In contrast to her daughter's typical quiet and introverted personality, hers had been a facade of an emotionless young woman. Months later, it was developed. She had watched it gradually take shape before her very eyes, and she had been powerless to stop it as her daughter's typical personality gradually disappeared beneath it. To the best of her knowledge, her daughter had only ever removed her mask once, on December 7th, the day of her 7th birthday, last year. Her heart ached from that memory. She had seen the hopeless hope in her daughter's eyes. The hours she had spent consoling Mizore after discovering her sobbing outside the village limits. As she recalled how she had only been able to identify her own daughter's suffering after 2 weeks of being completely and unforgivably unaware of it, an uncomfortable heartache crept into her once more. Idiotically, she thought the village would support her and give Mizore a chance. Given that they hadn't altered their behavior toward her, she hadn't anticipated that the village would actually treat her daughter that poorly. For the first few days, she should have been warned by locking herself in her room. It should have been evident from her daughter's refusal to play outside. She should have noticed her daughter's swollen eyes as soon as she caught her leaving the restroom. She had foolishly and naively believed that her daughter was just making things up. However, she didn't realize it until she had accidentally found her daughter in the kitchen. Mizore had been standing at her own neck with one of her kitchen knives. Had she been just seconds away, she would have shivered. She was aware of this since she had previously witnessed and experienced similar feelings. Being ignored by others or subjected to bullying by other kids. She could hardly imagine what it must be like to live in her daughter's place, even as her mother. Surara forced the memories out of her mind by briefly closing her eyes. A boy who might be able to relate to her daughter stood in front of her. Out of a shaky hope, Mizore had decided to let her mask fall in front of a boy. She examined the boy's mask intently. A shiver, albeit a slight one, went through her body as he exuded a subtle hint of it, a sadness so soul-freezing, tainted with so much sorrow. Even trying to compare it to her daughter's was too painful for her. Before she could go any further, she immediately stopped herself. But now that she had experienced it, it was too clear for her. She could almost feel the sadness that permeated his being just by staring at him. A deep, rooted instinct arose in her with the same vigor as when she discovered her daughter in the toilet. Just seconds before she passed out, she simply shifted. His body hadn't responded, and he wasn't sure why. In the past, whenever someone touched him abruptly, it always did, but this time, it didn't. He was interred in someone else. She had him in her arms, holding him in her maternal embrace. She placed one hand on his hand and gave him a gentle pat on the back of his head. She knelt down and embraced the boy, whispering tender words into his ear. Tears were welling up at the corners of her own closed eyes, but she refused to let them fall. His eyes were wide as he tried in vain to make sense of what was happening, and he stood motionless as his mind just stopped working. He made an effort to fight, to persuade himself that he wanted to fight, and to remind himself that it was just another trap. He could sense the woman's sincerity, though, as she was the one he knew had been able to recognize his mask. He felt a surge of emotions that he claimed he had long since suppressed. It overcame him, causing salty water to seep out of his eyes. Then everything came loose with it, like a sudden crack. He grasped her kimono and brought his hands up to his body. Sobs ripped through his body as he cried out in genuine sorrow, burying his head in her like a son would to his mother. He had heard the words, "Shush, it's okay," all his life, but he had never understood them. Words that conveyed the affection and concern he had been looking for all his life. As he tightened his hold on her clothing and his shaking body, he let out another muffled cry, "It'll be all right now." "Shush." She calmed his cries while giving him a tender back rub. As she continued to give him a motherly embrace, He gradually stopped crying and trembling. She dried his cheeks with her sleeves while raising her arms. Her eyes never left his trembling, excruciatingly vulnerable ones as she wiped away the tears. "Better?" she inquired. He nodded and sniffed. As he continued to gently wipe away his tears, she said in a slightly playful tone, "No more crying now, okay?" She took one of Naruto's hands and pulled him forward, then stood back up to her full height. She gently nudged him forward and trailed behind, saying, "You must be very hungry by now, nay?" Observing him as he moved, a small smile spreading to his eyes. She saw a flash of purple as he slid the divider to the side. Mizore was kneeling by the table, looking a little flushed and breathing a little more heavily. As Naruto took a seat at another part of the table, she pretended to cough and snatched up another set of chopsticks and a bowl. She settled his bowl and then sat down at the table. However, Surara glanced at her daughter, who was staring anxiously back, rather than going for food first. Mizore's eyes grew wide as he said, "Looks like you're going to need more training tomorrow, Mizore." She was aware of it. A chill went up her spine because she knew her mother had seen her unsuccessful attempt to overhear her talk with Naruto and that she was now likely to receive her mother's special training. Once more, she hung her head down and returned her focus to the food while mumbling a quiet affirmative. Surara smiled contentedly as she helped herself to her own food. Most likely, Mizore misunderstood what she had said. A smile that was almost demonic was on the verge of emerging. However, she stopped after taking her first bite when she saw Naruto fidgeting, anxious, and scared. From his chopsticks to his bowl of rice, his gaze darted from one dish to another. So far, he hadn't even touched his food, let alone eaten any of it. His hands trembled and he shifted uneasily. She was able to discern his anxieties and doubts in some way. She filled his bowl with copious amounts of all her dishes. As Mizore's inquisitive gaze followed her every move, Naruto appeared to recoil in disbelief. She politely teased him, asking rhetorically, "Eat up, Naruto. We can't have you falling sick, right?" His wide eyes darted from her to his food, back to her, and then back to his food. He cupped the bowl with unsteady hands and then glanced back at her, as if he was looking for confirmation. Surara nodded with a smile that only family members can have. That was the beginning of what ought to have been a race. It wouldn't be running, though, in this instance. He raised both to his mouth, grabbing the bowl in one hand and the pair of chopsticks in the other. He pushed the food down his throat quickly and frantically, using his right hand to fist over the chopsticks without any technique at all. A glimmer of sorrow ignited in Surara's eyes. She was able to identify the clues that pointed to his past. His past habits of shoving food down his throat warned him that if he didn't finish it right away, it might be cruelly taken away. But as soon as she saw what her daughter was doing, a frown that was beginning to form was swiftly replaced by a startled and amused smile. Mizore thought it strange, so she set out to correct her friend out of naivete. Naruto noticed that his attempts to eat were abruptly stopping. He felt two gentle hands over his and looked up, less anxious than curious. He turned to see Mizore grinning naively behind him. His confusion lasted only a few seconds before he realized what was going on. His cheeks flushed a little as Mizore struggled to hold the chopsticks correctly with his fingers. She pushed herself against him as she attempted to finish her self-appointed task, straining from behind him to reach his hands. She attempted to make Naruto's hands imitate her finger movements, almost like an external glove. She let out an irritated puff of air when she couldn't move Naruto's hand. She brought her other hand over to help him place his bowl and other hand on the table. She kept adjusting his stiff fingers in a position that resembled an embrace, her hands encircling him. His cheeks became hot with embarrassment, and his face blushed deeper. He tried his best to mimic her gestures while looking shamefully at his hand. It appeared that he had passed some kind of silent test after a few more seconds of fumbling with his fingers. With a triumphant sigh, Mizore picked up a piece of fish with his hand and fed it to Naruto. As he closed his mouth over the fish, Naruto's blush intensified. She returned to her seat and continued eating, congratulating herself on a job well done. She glanced at Naruto, whose hand was still where she had left them. It was almost as if he was motionless. His gaze was fixed on his hand, but it was unfocused. Mizore looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and mild fear, and her brow tightened. "Naruto?" inquired Mizore. Naruto's blush deepened even more as that seemed to jolt him out of whatever daze he had been in. But at least Naruto was eating again, according to Mizore. This time, though, he ate at a pace that was comparable to Mizore's, lowering his head to concentrate on his meal while maintaining eye contact with her. He had to eat awkwardly for a minute before he was able to get over his embarrassment. "Arigato. Thank you." As he chewed slowly on a piece of meat he had eaten, he made eye contact and smiled awkwardly. Mizore's head tipped slightly as she grinned at his expression of gratitude. Surara experienced a surge of joy and optimism for her daughter. She already had a number of schemes running through her head. She had made up her mind. Naruto would undoubtedly become Mizore's friend, boyfriend, and eventually lifelong companion. She put down her bowl and turned to Naruto. As he slowly processed the question, his gaze shifted to her. "Do you have anywhere to stay, Naruto?" he asked. He gave a negative, downcast shake of his head as his chewing slowed. As her daughter cast a worried glance at the boy, her anxiety became quite apparent. Surara waited, trying not to look at Mizore. Her daughter would simply allow the remaining pieces to fall into place on their own if she was correct. As her mind raced to come up with ways to assist him, Mizore bit her bottom lip. "With them, perhaps?" With beseeching eyes, she asked her mother, "Haha, mother, could he stay with us?" With a startled expression, Naruto raised his head and turned to face Mizore. She asked as though she was still considering the question, trying to hide her smile because she had been correct. Surara said, as though it were their greatest issue, "Where would he sleep though? We don't have any guest rooms." Before an idea came to her, her daughter kept biting her bottom lip for a short while. "He could sleep in my room," she exclaimed with enthusiasm as she developed her concept. What would make a difference when he had already been recuperating by sleeping in her room? Surara was wondering how much she could get away with, but neither of them knew it. Perhaps she could explain that all of the extra futons are being washed, but that wouldn't work. Her eyes mirrored her thoughts, which were in a distant world. However, she immediately controlled herself and pretended to be a thoughtful, worried mother for a brief moment. "For tonight?" asked Surara. She caught a glimpse of Naruto's tentative gaze as he gazed into his bowl out of the corner of her eye. As she attempted to mimic a pleading puppy, Mizore's voice pleaded, "As long as possible." She turned her head sideways, giving the impression that she had just given it some thought, and said, "I guess that's fine," with a hint of worry in her voice. She transformed a mental smirk into a sheepish grin and thought naively, "Let it be known that it wasn't me who refused to offer my room." Perhaps this boy could bring her daughter happiness if the village couldn't. As he fiddled with the last of his food, he whispered softly, "Anyo, I'm grateful and all, but I don't want to trouble you." As soon as Surara saw her daughter's sudden panic, she cheerfully reassured him, "You won't be a trouble at all, Naruto." But fear gripped him. He had never experienced such kindness in his life. What if, in the future, they felt that he was a burden? "If you really want to, you can help us with our work and chores." Surara saw an immediate improvement in the reluctant expression on his face. Thank you," he said, fighting to contain his emotions as his voice threatened to crack. Surara said softly, "You're welcome." She couldn't shake the faint trace of sadness that persisted as confetti flew through her mind, praising her for a job well done. Surara finished her statement by getting up and gathering the empty plates. "Well, if you're done." Now it was Mizore's turn. He pushed his almost empty bowl to her while nodding. He didn't even realize that it was the first time he had voluntarily given up perfectly good food, no matter how small. "Come." Poked out of his emotional outburst, he turned to Mizore, who was cheerfully beckoning him to follow with persistent shoulder prodding. She exuded excitement in waves, and before he knew it, any doubts he had been harboring had vanished. He allowed himself to be guided by his hand as her fingers encircled his, a smile as joyful as ever emerging. One more silent curse. She had searched 4 villages in all. The tree overhead cast a shadow over her diminutive figure as she perched on a slender tree branch. It was easy to blend in with the snow-covered tree because of its white feathers. As a last conversation, she swept her eyes over the town and, predictably, found nothing new. She sighed inwardly. Once more, it was a human village. Even though there was a lot of yokai energy in this world, it seems that humans dominated the majority of the obvious. Not to mention the numerous yokai barriers that hindered her senses. She hadn't yet entered any because of this as well. With so many around, she couldn't even lock on one specifically enough to figure out how to get inside without possibly alerting the yokai inside, whereas a few would have been easy. She took off into the sky with a strong wing flap. Her white feathers swiftly shimmered and transformed into the unchanging blue of the sky, but no one else could see them. She hoped Kazushi was enjoying himself more than she was. As the events unfolded in Sarutobi Hiruzen, the third Hokage continued to get headache after headache. He bit down on his pipe. Following the catastrophe, issue after issue just kept coming up. He had used nearly all of his Anbu to secure the area when the explosion finally subsided. Then, in order to maintain control over the civilian population, he had to send Junin and Shunin, which caused a great deal of opposition from the civilian council. In the end, he had to send genin to patrol the village as scouts. Even worse, the explosion affected the majority of Konoha's economic sector. This meant that the village's military would be underfunded in addition to requiring him to borrow money from the daimyo. He was also prohibited from allowing his village to exhibit weakness. To maintain their reputation as the strongest ninja village and to repel hostile nations, he would have to send his ninja on constant missions. Even more frustrating was the fact that everything in the vicinity of the disaster was vaporized, making it nearly impossible to determine what caused it. The annoying issue of the village scapegoat was added to his list of problems. Since the explosion had destroyed Naruto Uzumaki's apartment, it was only reasonable to assume that the boy was dead. His tracking seals were not reacting. He would no longer be able to divert civilians with that boy. Damn. With so much of their focus on the damned boy, it had actually gotten easier. What have I done to merit this? Sarutobi let out a sigh through his pipe. His door opened as though to retaliate, and another headache entered, one that was likely going to surpass all of his present ones in severity. An elderly man named Danzo Shimura, who had to use a walking stick with his free hand due to a cast on his arm and only one visible eye, asked, "Hiruzen, what has happened?" Kaharu Udatane and Homura Mitokado, two elders, were behind him. Hiruzen sighed in irritation and took his pipe out of his mouth. He was anything but stupid. Even though he was aware that Danzo most likely already knew what had happened, he still asked, probably to conceal the fact that he had a private military force, which he was sadly unable to prove. As a result, he was unable to have the blasted fool executed for betraying his country. He feared their next question. A third of Konoha has been destroyed by an explosion, and the village's economy is the worst off. Answering without killing them was always such a pain. With a frown on her face, Kaharu asked disgustedly, how could such a thing have happened? He clenched his fist and forced himself to explain, as if he would know. Hiruzen stood up and gazed out the window at the crater, saying, unfortunately there is still no clear lead on what caused it. The blast incinerated everything and anyone it touched. It is impossible to gather evidence. Even he would have been a victim that day if it had gone a little farther. If he went a little farther, he might think about renouncing his role as Hokage in order to murder those three elders. Heck, he was thinking about it already. Anbu patrols? Homura asked, giving Hiruzen a serious look. After all, village security was in jeopardy if there were insufficient patrols. Which would also clarify how this kind of thing came about in the first place. The three other elders in the room understood the hidden meaning of the statement, which might have seemed like a straightforward excuse to others. Despite all their training, ninja still have emotions. They had been celebrating the demon birds and Kyuubi's defeats and unfortunately grieving over their losses. So much so that they neglected their duties. They were all members of the group that attacked Naruto Uzumaki. Danzo, the presumed former leader of Root, responded, that's why you should have never disbanded my Root Foundation. Hiruzen detested the old man's deception. He was aware that Root was still active, and Danzo was aware of this as well. Getting the proof to prosecute him was the only issue. Looking at the pictures of the previous two Hokages of the Leaf, Hiruzen said, I will not have my ninja without emotion. Those that lack emotion lack the will of fire. I will not throw away my predecessors' teachings and beliefs. He wished they were still here to handle this. If you're Nin, we are not going to discuss something that I decided years ago, Danzo. Hiruzen intervened. Hiruzen, who could already feel his headache getting worse, asked suspiciously, what are you really here for? What about the Uzumaki? Danzo inquired. Hiruzen let out a frustrated sigh. From the beginning, Danzo had pursued the boy. He was fairly certain that Danzo, along with the other two elders, knew why. His Root operatives were incredibly competent. Kyuubi's soul was in Naruto, and its powers were officially imprisoned in young Seigo. He had a good feeling Danzo knew the truth. The Uzumaki child was the true prize, even though Seigo did possess the Kyuubi's abilities. The child with Phoenix-like abilities. As Hiruzen turned to face Danzo, a somber expression appeared on his face. The boy's apartment was caught in the blast and he has yet to be found. He is assumed to be dead. The man was unfazed by it. However, whatever plans Danzo had for the Uzumaki were shattered. His was, too. Hiruzen gave a frustrated click of his tongue. Danzo tapped his walking cane lightly on the ground with his one good arm and said, so the Uzumaki is missing or dead. This would have never had happened if you just gave me custody of the boy in the first place. Do not assume that for what proof have you given me that everything would have turned out as you planned? As I'm sure you know though, Danzo. Our secondary is still fine. Seigo was far from the blast zone. Hiruzen challenged as he narrowed his eyes. However, the elder's unwavering expressions demonstrate their callousness. However, the fact still is that you lost our greatest opportunity. Your old age has gotten to you, Hiruzen. Pick another successor and be done with it, Danzo said. Hiruzen sidestepped another of his many questions, saying, At this point, picking a new Hokage will not fix anything. He then glanced at the clock. Hiruzen merely walked past his advisors with heavy steps, saying, "Now if you excuse, I have to go to a meeting, please leave. I believe we have to take things into our own hands, seeing that our Hokage obviously cannot solve this in an effective way. He has already lost Uzumaki. It is only a matter of time before Seigo is lost under his care as well," Danzo said. Homura said, "I agree." Kaharu trailed behind, "So do I." Danzo said impartially, tapping his cane lightly on the ground, "When the leaves of a tree are rotten and useless, one has to remove them. For as long as there exists the roots, the tree will recover." The advisors of the Hokage turned their backs on their Hokage at that point. Too many other pieces would fall because of the stone. The alterations are irreversible. Naruto followed Mizore as she slid the door open and went into her room after walking to the end of the brief hallway. As he entered a portion of her life, his gaze strayed. Numerous stalks twisted and flowed along the room's grayish walls, making them anything but plain. As he followed the path of a single branch, the line's colors gradually shifted from the dark ocean blue to the pale sky blue. He couldn't help but notice as he surveyed the space that it didn't match the typical descriptions of a girl's room he had heard in the village. A curtain taped over the room's lone window prevented the bright and open lighting that was frequently described, the glowing pink floral designs that are typically mentioned, and the usual abundance of girly toys and makeup that are supposed to be present in every girl's room were all absent. Plain is the first word that would spring to mind if Naruto had to sum it up. However, he probably wouldn't use that word. Even though the room appeared deserted, almost uncanny, he sensed what he would characterize as a cozy and inviting feeling. His eyes immediately went to the purple-haired girl in one corner of the room as he tried to figure out why. But when he noticed what she was doing, his attempts to comprehend were just lost. Her short hands attempted to grasp something on a top shelf, causing her small frame to bounce up and down the floor. He could clearly see what was out of her reach from where he stood. There was apparently a spare futon stored there. Before he knew it, he was laughing softly. Unfortunately for his fleeting sense of humor, it was short-lived because Mizore turned abruptly around. She was breathing more heavily than usual and her face was flushed, but he could see that her eyes were staring below his, and embarrassment had taken the place of confusion. As hurried counters were prevented from leaving her lips, her mouth opened and closed multiple times. However, an acceptable comeback, in her opinion, eventually emerged after a few long, awkward seconds. Naruto heard the mocking murmur, "It's not like you can do any better." Her eyes were level with the top of his head, and her face was schooled. Nevertheless, he heard it and could easily follow the direction of her gaze. "It doesn't make a difference." Naruto angrily defended his height while also scolding his own diminutive stature. For the briefest of moments, Mizore's face showed shock. She hadn't intended for him to hear it, but for some reason, this time, she couldn't bring herself to ignore and brush him off as she had done with so many other people for the majority of her life. "It does," she said, raising her voice a little as she stepped forward once more and a defiant grin appeared. Then I'll prove it doesn't," Naruto argued back, his face resolute to the point. Mizore's smirk faltered for a second, leaving her momentarily perplexed, but she quickly gathered herself and went on. "You're bluffing," Mizore growled softly but sharply. She maintained her challenging stare, but she was already beginning to have some reservations because Naruto's resolve remained unwavering. She had the opportunity to display some childish pettiness for the first time in her life. Impulsively, she continued. This time, she declared at a volume that was almost normal. If you do, I'll do one thing you say, but if you can't, you have to admit I'm better." His angry face had changed to a suddenly cunning grin, and she clenched her hands to divert her attention as her heart leapt. He couldn't possibly dare, would he? A cunning gleam filled his eyes, like a cat that had already caught its prey. Before she knew it, Naruto had leapt, and to her surprise, he had landed on the wall, where he bounced off with agility in the direction of the top shelf. He landed with the futon in his hands in a nearly elegant manner. Mizore stepped back, her body filled with trivial horror. With an almost audible click, she forced her mouth shut before anything could come out. She turned her body sideways, her eyes torn downward as she stared at him in disbelief. The embarrassment that filled her overcame any anger that might have developed. "Well, Mizore?" asked Naruto in a playful manner. She folded her hands and looked at the wall in front of her, stuttering, shut up." Naruto sang rhetorically, "You have to do one thing I say, huh?" Mizore frantically shook her head negatively, hopefully, tightening her grip around her hands. "Mizore," he dragged her name out on his tongue as he started to approach her from behind. I was joking," was said in a hopeful yet futile whisper. After just 3 seconds, she bowed her head in surrender to his playful, demanding stare. She whispered, "Okay, What do you want me to do? His eyes strayed to the side, and he positioned his thumb and index finger under his chin in a contemplative position. 10 seconds went by, then 20. After a minute, Naruto began to hum softly. After another minute, Mizore finally couldn't handle the excruciating tension. She glared into Naruto's eyes and hissed, "Say it already," in what Naruto perceived to be her version of a shout. Without hesitation, he said, "Smile." Mizore took a startled step backwards and nearly stumbled, asking, "What?" "Smile," she muttered hesitantly. Naruto confirmed his demand with a smile of his own, saying, "Yeah, smile." "Smile," Mizore said, looking down while twirling her fingers. "Smile." "Is something wrong, Mizore?" Naruto asked, her face displaying genuine bewilderment with a hint of concern. It wasn't very typical for her to smile. So far in her life, she had remained mostly hidden behind a school mask. In order to preserve some semblance of sanity from the glares and discrimination she encountered from the village, she had begun to wear an emotionless face. Only infrequently, occasions when she was with her parents, specifically, did she spontaneously smile. She believed that she had long since forgotten how to smile and how it felt to smile consciously. Her eyes widened and she froze. Had she not smiled, even giggled, with Naruto earlier? "Mizore." A hand landed on her shoulder, jolting her out of her reverie. She instantly tore her shoulder back from his grasp out of instinct. Her hands rose to the point where they pointed at Naruto, and her legs kicked up. She stopped just as she was ready to shoot a few shards and unleash her ice claws. Her blue, worried, shocked, and secretly afraid eyes locked with his. Suddenly, her surroundings came flooding back to her. She folded her legs. I'm sorry," she said again, avoiding eye contact as she gazed at him. Her eyes wavered and she fell into a blubbering mess. She had come dangerously close to revealing her abilities to him. Her mouth froze as two hands gripped her this time. A pair of blue eyes leveled with hers, one on each shoulder. "Mizore?" he repeated, his voice tinged with regret and anxiety. "What's wrong?" Mizore was unable to form the words, I, and his mouth remained open. All she felt was a clumsy tugging of her lips as she made a fruitless attempt to smile. She closed her eyes and said, "I don't know how to smile. It was this. After all, what kind of freak doesn't know how to smile?" Naruto would no longer be her friend. Tiny droplets threatened to spill out of her clenched fists. This time, it wouldn't even be due to her abilities. She froze as her hands were taken and her fingers were forced open before she could begin to tremble. Naruto's hands were over hers as they were held tenderly. She was stunned after her eyes slowly opened. She had anticipated annoyance, sympathy, or even pity, but the expression on his face. His eyes mirrored hers, revealing to her what she had repeatedly seen in mirrors. His eyes glowed with a hidden but familiar pain, and he had a slight sad smile. He gave her hands a light squeeze and said, "I understand, so you don't need to cry, okay?" She sniffed once, then twice, and then leaned in close to Naruto, allowing his cozy embrace to envelop her. "Thank you." His fingers danced with her hair, creating patterns on her scalp that gave her the sensation of a gentle massage. She parted after she had at last hushed her grief. She was perplexed to see Naruto grinning once more before he pointed a single finger directly at her face. Before her own hand raised to feel her face, she consciously felt it. A grin, she put her head on his shoulder and gave him another tight hug without pausing. "Thank you," she whispered, her emotions evident. Long forgotten was the second futon. They had slept next to each other and ended the night with their hands linked. He opened his eyes. It was as abrupt as the last time. Just pop, he was here without any prior notice or transition. After wishing Mizore a restful sleep, he was on a futon attempting to fall asleep, and then he was here before the typical minutes of restless thoughts had arrived. But as he surveyed his surroundings again, his eyes gradually widened and he had to reposition multiple times because some things just didn't match what he had seen here before. For starters, the cage in front of him had a grassy clearing with sporadic trees. In the distance, a few of the trees loomed into the shadowy void above. He could still see birds, some close and some far away, dancing gracefully in the air. A big tree off to the side was another point. Now, it might have appeared to him as just another part of the forest, but the likelihood had been completely eliminated by a rather large opening surrounded by elaborate carvings. Without pausing for a second, he walked past the bars and toward the cave. However, he was only able to focus on his surroundings because of the astounding details that left him in awe of the straightforward yet intricate beauty in his thoughts. The expanse of grass swaying in a gentle wind, the crisp fresh air, and the soft flow of water from a river he had just noticed behind a few trees. From the flowers adorning the area to the occasional bunny hopping in the tall grass, Everything seemed incredibly real. It's beautiful, isn't it? Naruto simply nodded calmly rather than leaping. What is this? Inquired Naruto. With longing, Kurama answered, this was my home. Naruto was taken aback when he noticed the subtle hint. However, he later realized that his mind was clearer when he was in his mindscape. The elder creature was perched on a nearby tree's branch, his legs dangling in midair and his back resting against the trunk. As he pointed, Kurama sighed with longing. Kurama said, take a closer look. He followed instructions out of curiosity. Now that he was closer, he could more easily see the etched symbols surrounding the entrance. They were images and symbols of a nine-tailed fox in various graceful poses that were combined to form an intricate work of art. His gaze wandered over the diagrams, and he was struck by how intricate and well considered the carvings were. Friend, warrior, protector, and leader. The fox was described in those terms, but as he reached the very top, his eyes widened as a wave of shock washed over him. His eyes recognized the familiar swirl carved at the top of the arch, and he uttered a helpless, "What?" The old creature's question, "Do you want to know?" carried more weight than words could express. While his body remained motionless, Naruto's gaze was fixed on Kurama. Did he? He shut his eyes and pondered for a short while. The one thing that was always the same in his life was that the symbol was always present in whatever he was wearing. It wasn't just his clothing. Furthermore, they would also show up in his dreams on the few occasions when he was able to sleep soundly. He was certain each time more hands appeared in his dreams, but he never recalled anything else from those dreams. It certainly seemed strange to him now that he was able to think clearly. He was aware that it was more than a mere symbol. There was much more to it than that. He knew he would regret letting it slip. After he hesitated a moment, he said, I do. Kurama looked back at him and asked, why? His mind was racing, trying to figure out why. He sensed that there was a gnawing need to know somewhere deep within his soul. But why, once more? He concluded with resolve and a sense of purposelessness, saying, I want to. No, I need to know Kurama. It's this feeling inside me, I can't explain it. Kurama didn't express whether Naruto's remarks pleased him. Kurama responded, then may truly be one of them, both in body and spirit. Naruto let himself fall before he could say anything more, and his legs took the force of the fall. He straightened up again and raised a hand. Kurama gestured for Naruto to follow him, saying, come Naruto, come and prove you truly are one of them. The elderly guardian proceeded to a room he never imagined he would return to. The scene had been lively and cozy just a minute before. The first 3 minutes of his walk into the tree had been filled with love, security, and warmth. The rooms were cozy because of the soft orange light that had previously been used to bathe everything in the old but cozy-looking rugs that had covered his feet. But that was only a minute ago. The surroundings were ancient and mystical now. The walls had changed. They had lowered themselves into the ground at some point. He was surrounded by rough, unadorned stone walls that exuded an old-world sense of strength and wisdom. He felt like a tiny dot floating through weightless space in the overwhelming atmosphere. However, it felt correct at the same time, as if he were at home. He was so engrossed in the emotion that he didn't realize they had arrived at their destination. His mouth opened in silent awe, and his eyes grew wide. Underneath the vines that covered the walls, green lines stretched out in certain directions. They were crisscrossed by golden lines that were slightly less bright but trailed in circular patterns before settling in a number of golden orbs that hung off the ceiling in strategically placed but seemingly random locations. Both they and the room were bathed in a serene glow from their combined gold glow. Kurama whispered, beautiful, isn't it? Naruto's gaze shifted to the middle of the vast cavern and he simply nodded. There, the ground was carved with a big circular design. He recognized the pattern. Kurama approached the center slowly and remarked, this place is a sacred Uzumaki memory hold. Memory hold? Naruto had not moved an inch since entering the cavern. Eyes continued to wander the walls and ceiling, enthralled by the innumerable other lines that glow in every conceivable hue, more than he could possibly identify. With a tone of quiet reverence, Kurama explained, it keeps a record of Uzumaki knowledge and history, all of the Uzumaki's knowledge and history. At this moment, Naruto was finally struck by the other detail. Uzumaki? Wasn't that just a name he was given at random? The Uzumaki, you are one of them. Your very being in here proves it. Had you not been one, this scared ground would have killed you within an instant of setting foot in here. Kurama stated with finality, making Naruto taking a silent gulp. Kurama turned and extended his hand, saying, but you were and as such, standing in the middle of the Uzumaki symbol that has been engraved on the ground. With hesitation in every step, Naruto cautiously approached him. From Kurama, his shockingly submissive tone, or the very aura of the place he did not know. When Naruto approached slowly, Kurama continued quietly, "The Uzumaki were masters of the art of sealing, fuinjutsu. According to Kurama, they made seals that did things simply impossible. I used to think there was a limit nonetheless, but now, to think anyone, even them, had managed to do something like this." Kurama's gaze had long since moved away from Naruto and across the room in erratic patterns. A single place, kept in a separate pocket dimension accessible only by those it recognizes via a simple thought which it can detect regardless of place, even mindscapes. Kurama sensed the power emanating from the location as the self-sustaining seals powered and replenished themselves in a manner akin to that of living things. It was still intact, regardless of the destruction of its original and sole anchor to a physical dimension at Uzushiogakure. Kurama halted his wonder from growing any larger. An old duty called. Eyes now once more firmly on his charge, he stepped into the ancient seal below them. Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto gazed intently into Kurama's eyes, which whirled with a sense of obligation and longing. With his hand still outstretched and his 9 tails fully extended and swirling behind him, he asked, "Do you accept your heritage? To promise to embrace what you were and to accept all that is you from your Uzumaki blood?" The seal beneath them glowed, identifying the two in the action they were about to take. Every line in the cavern had synchronized pulses that glowed and flowed toward the Uzumaki seal beneath them. The colors blended together as they poured from precisely spaced points at the edge. They followed the carving, swirling and mixing. Their colors merged as they got closer. "Will you accept your history and all its knowledge?" At the center of the Uzumaki seal, a perfect mixture of white had formed directly beneath them. Kurama's hand formed a white orb at the same moment. He could see the hope and sincerity in Kurama's eyes. Naruto's mind, for the first time, focused on a single thing as his mind ran 1,000 miles a second. He had been lost, confused, and alone all his life. He was only motivated by the primal need to survive. However now there was a place that belonged to him. He was a part of something that was his. Why? He couldn't think of a definitive answer. All he knew was that he needed to accept something that was rooted in his very being and deep within him. His soul, his very being, longed to connect with what had been shown to him. He slowly reached for the white orb that was beckoning him. There was no room for hesitation. There was no justification for turning down what he needed and what he desired. His 9-tailed guardian in front of him as well as the room he was in heard him softly whisper, "I accept." Then as such, take what is rightfully yours, Royal Uzumaki heir. The regular pulses from the room intensified as the white light grew brighter. All around them, their power was palpable. Then, in an instant, a wall of golden energy surged up around them, turning the white light golden. Kurama's eyes glowed with disbelieving realization, and his eyes widened in shock. But that's when Naruto's hand solidly blotted out the light, leaving the room dark. However, a single thought echoed in his mind as his instinctive and obedient senses verified what he had just witnessed: High Phoenix. The question escaped his lips as he was once again in a strange place. "Where am I?" There were countless windows and emptiness all around him. "Your memory." Without anticipating a response, Naruto snapped his head in the direction of the voice. Kurama went on after observing Naruto's expressionless face as the boy gazed in mild amazement at the sights outside the windows, each of which depicted a distinct memory. Kurama clarified as he tried to recall his main responsibility. Normally the Uzumaki memory hold would simply implant basic Uzumaki knowledge and history into your brain. Enough memories to give you a headache but not enough to destroy your mind. Kurama used parts of his strong mind to sort through the vast amount of information the blonde had been given, explaining, "However, it appears that apart from imparting into you the knowledge, it has also recognized you as a High Phoenix." As he tried the word, Naruto questioned, "High Phoenix? It means, you are now one of the small handful of phoenixes recognized to be able to go beyond the level of the gods, one of the few destined to lead the Uzumaki." "What?" The memory hold consequently imparted all of its knowledge to you, and ordinarily it would have established a timed seal to gradually increase the amount of memories you receive as your mind matures in order to prevent death. But it activated one of my dormant commands because I was present. My goal is now to be your faithful vassal, not to find and defend a single Uzumaki. One of my primary responsibilities now is to limit the amount of information that is implanted in you at once. Kurama. The elderly person ignored the call and carried on, his eyes taking on a detached expression. Naturally, this position entails a great deal of responsibility because I have to carefully assess how much your mind can manage. Not to mention that some of the information is restricted to me as well. It appears to me as gray windows with only a phrase that summarizes it. I will therefore need to exercise extreme caution when allowing those to enter your mind. However, I sue. Kurama. The rambling fox humanoid was yelled at by Naruto. He paused mid-sentence with his mouth hanging open, looking perplexed for a few seconds before abruptly closing it and grinning sheepishly. Sorry, I tend to get carried away sometimes, so, which details do you want me to clarify? Kurama inquired. Naruto's eyes widened as he considered everything Kurama had said in his non-stop speech and became alert at the question. None of them, he muttered, almost incredulously, because the sharpest knife couldn't pierce the ensuing silence if it were real. You fully comprehended everything I said? His inquiry was tinged with a good deal of skepticism. Yep. Naruto concluded his response with a victory sign, allowing a contented smile to gradually appear on his face. Kurama gazed for several minutes before closing his eyes and appearing to search, with movement visible beneath his eyelids. Kurama's eyes finally opened after another awkward minute of silence from Naruto. Kurama said hesitantly, unbelievable, the reintegration of your suppressed mind is already complete. Well, it feels like everything is much clearer now, Naruto said, my thoughts aren't as clouded as they used to be. He paused, then his eyes slid to one side as they gained a distant look. A minute later, he had to raise both hands to nest his head because he was suddenly struck by a headache, and as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving a whole array of memories in its wake. Are you all right, child? His body drooped, and a steady hand gripped his shoulder. At the end, Naruto steadied his hazy vision and said, I think so. What just? Naruto's question was cut short as he searched his new memories, his eyes widening as he saw flashbacks to past events he had never experienced. The typical collection of recollections. Naruto just nodded shakily. Rest now, your mind will be able to sort them out easier as you sleep. Naruto found himself on a bed in an instant as the world around them changed once more. Naruto, exercise caution. The world soon turned into darkness for Naruto, who was unable to respond because most of his senses had gone haywire. Some of the memories are not pleasant. There was a lingering taint of blood everywhere, despite the sun's brilliance and the scent of freshly watered plants. There were sounds of sharpened metal hitting metal, of refined steel chopping flesh, of fine tips piercing skin, and, just below in volume, the cries of innumerable people, cries of anguish, and the cries of soldiers charging into battle. Before the formation of the hidden villages, the elemental nations were nothing more than a barbaric wasteland. Nevertheless, those who wished otherwise were unavoidably born within the veil of constant bloodshed and suffering. Of the few who did wish for an end to the fighting and the loss caused by war, even fewer actually survived long before they were destroyed. Nevertheless, a group of these people had met on a fateful island. They were people with scared souls. They had been tried and torn by the unrelenting violence of the elemental nations. They had learned to turn only to those they trusted, those who had been with them when they were young, when they were weak, and when they were in trouble. They had hidden themselves on the same island as separate groups at first, but eventually they opened up and pooled their talent as inevitable events gifted them their shared experiences. They flourished away from the never-ending chaos afflicting the rest of the world. They ate food from their farms. They had made friends from those they trusted with all their hearts. They loved one another, and eventually they had become a single family, a family with a sense of loyalty so strong that they left their mark on the world for generations to come. After only a few short years, however, their newly discovered happiness and tranquility were put in jeopardy when a neighboring warlord learned of them via his warships passing close to the island. To the warlord, they were just more slaves under his control. Ninja scouts sent by the warlord sank their fishing boats, and it took only a few days for those people to realize the terrible news. They barely had 100 members, and only 9 of them had respectable ninja skills. A family of strangers and lost souls who had come together, their bonds forged from the hardest of trials, fully appreciated their slim chances, even though a few had nearly fallen into despair. They had no chance against an army of kunoichi and shinobi, but they refused to leave their fates up to chance. They prepared for battle, took up arms, and showed little support for one another because they had formed a single belief based on their shared experiences of the horrors that had shaped their lives. For family. They cried and cheered as they honed their makeshift walls and sharpened their makeshift weapons. As the attack drew closer, they prepared every day from sunrise to sunset. Their old leader, who wasn't a ninja himself, believed in himself and others, and that was all he needed to lead his family in protecting their home and hearts. Every night, he lifted their spirits with humorous jokes or exaggerated stories. Then, too soon, the day of their trial dawned, and a wall of enemy ships, each flying the warlord's ruthless flag, appeared on the horizon. The battle had already started, but they would arrive in an hour. 10 enemy ninja arrived with a loud explosion, sent early to destroy their defense and hope, and within the first second, one of them was killed by a defending ninja's well-placed chakra. Enhanced arrow, which would be the only easy kill they would get. Almost immediately after, it was a case of 9-1-on-1 matches raging along the coastline, with occasional regrouping and rethinking before returning to their battles. At the wall built 100 meters back, a line of archers and warriors watched helplessly as their ninja family fought. In a shinobi battle, they would be nothing more than sheep caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unfortunately, a quarter of an hour later, all 9 of their ninja were paralyzed by poisoned senbon and lined up in a display of devastating cruelty. When some realized what was going to happen, their emotions took over and they charged regardless of the enemy ninja, their arrows and frantic slashes blocked by a simple barrier technique, to their agony. Since they had been away from battle for years, they were no match for ninja who were still in touch with their skills. A lead enemy ninja had taken his cue to announce the execution of those who dared defy their lord and master. With a cruel glint, he pointed at the defender furthest to the right and ordered the first death, while the warlord's ninja held the 9 defenders upright and clearly visible to the others, who could only watch with teary eyes. Unknown to all who had been on the ground, 4 ancient beings had been watching. 4 phoenixes, the last of their kind awake, who had been watching from the very day the people below them who were currently crying and shouting had set foot on the island. Undiscovered by the island's inhabitants, was a volcano hidden deep within the island's forests which housed the 4 phoenixes. Within the volcano was their chosen final site of rest. They had been among others of their kind, from the time they together with 20 other phoenixes had chosen the volcano to be their final site of rest. A phoenix was an immortal bird of fire, never able to die. As a consequence, when a phoenix reached a certain point in its life when it no longer has ties to the waking world, they are able to enter their final sleep. Their version of death, as they simply let themselves stay unconscious indefinitely and likely forever. However, a family of 4 phoenixes had never been able to. Among others of their kind they had tried and tried countless times. But every time they were cursed with sleeplessness. They thought they no longer had ties to the world, but no matter how much they wished it, their final sleep never came. When a large number of humans arrived on their island, they decided to ignore it because they thought that, like the countless others they had seen, they would eventually kill each other off. However, as time went on, those who were able to observe covertly and sense feelings to a certain degree became intrigued and curious. They were aware that, while it was not impossible for humans to tolerate one another for decades, it was possible for them to be wary of those who had no such motives and no trace of murderous taint drew their attention. To their heightened interest and delight, they soon discovered that the humans had formed bonds with one another, as they supported, helped, and cherished one another. Several times, they pretended to be random people in order to experience what they had created, and before they knew it, they had formed another bond to the world. Even though they had seen and understood the unique people of their island, they had no way of knowing that even they would regard them as anything more than monsters or weapons, so they resisted and chose to watch when the day came when what they had begun to love was threatened by a greedy animal. But no matter how hard they tried, they were unable to stop themselves, and after repeatedly reasoning against themselves, they finally came to the conclusion that, if not for what they valued, then at least for what was worth preserving. A chilling voice, coming from all directions at once, declared the enemy ninja to be vile creatures and promised protection to those deemed worthy, holding them all in place as the killing blow descended. 4 fire pillars appeared out of the sky in front of them. 1 burned the enemy ninja who were about to deliver the death blow, 2 burned the 2 who were keeping the barrier up, and a 4th burned between the main enemy ninja and the crowd of people who were looking on with hope. 4 immortal birds of fire, 4 ancient beings of fire, the last family of phoenixes had discovered something valuable to defend. Halfway through, the lead ninja had barely time to ask a question before he found himself missing a head. Unbelievably accurate fire rays appeared out of nowhere and shot from head to head, leaving 6 dead bodies to fall lifelessly onto the bloodied sand before the shocked eyes of the crowd. 3 flew up into the sky in a majestic display of power, leaving fiery trails in their wake. The last turned to face the group of people huddled behind him, and in a simple show of trust, the form of a yellow bird vanished as it was replaced by the body of a man, whose hand was outstretched and his eyes glided over the people before they settled over their leader. He was satisfied that, although it had taken them a few seconds to gather themselves, their trusted leader had stepped up to greet him with a firm handshake before turning around and directing their attention to the approaching enemy ships. Then, in a flash of speed, 3 enormous forms of fire appeared in mid-air, each resembling a phoenix with glowing eyes that pierced the souls of the enemies. They then swung around in circles before abruptly gaining a slightly more solid form and plunging into the water, leaving the enemy ninja with rebreathers below the water with no chance as superheated water rose and cool water sank, creating powerful currents that gave rise to enormous whirlpools. The ships above were sunk with streams of pure fire, doomed in their watery graves, and in a matter of minutes, every enemy reached the ocean floor. The islanders watched in relief and hope as joyful cries and tears emerged, joyfully expressing their gratitude to the four humanoid but non-human entities that now floated in front of them. At that moment, the four otherworldly beings let their joyful smiles shine. The Uzumaki began on that day, and as the phoenixes led, taught, and protected the people, they developed relationships with them as equals, teachers, and eventually leaders. On the day they formally declared their intention to stay, they shed tears of joy as the celebrations lasted for days, and on the last day, they gave themselves a banner to follow. Their flag was made in honor of the beings who had been their saviors and hope, and it featured a swirl and people covered in the outlines of beautiful birds to symbolize their society and family and to symbolize how they had been saved. He had never expected such things to be possible with seals despite all the world-shattering experiences he had already had with them in his long life, and Kurama, Naruto's protector, sat next to him as similar memories flashed before his mind. Though he had heard about the history the boy was sorting, he had only ever heard it through words and pictures, so the sensations he felt from the implanted memories were something else entirely. He even had to let out an odd whistle as he experienced the memories his mind was sorting. His eyes gained a distant look as he thought back to his transformation. He had been the leader of the 9 ninja that fateful day. When years later he and the other 8 had been offered the chance to protect what was most important to them by their saviors, he had barely hesitated. Millennia later, now, his satisfaction and joy he gained from protecting his family had not dimmed in the slightest. Being the strongest of the 9 before their transformations, he had again been the most powerful after they had been turned into yokai. He had become a 9-tailed fox demon and the others had become other demons with a decrease in number of tails for every consecutive transformation. He had been given his eternal task by the first royal head of the Uzumaki. The same being who had created the Uzumaki memory hold and started its use. He had been taught many things about the memory hold, but much had been general. The special bits he had ever known included the secondary task of the hold to recognize high phoenixes, one of which had been its creator. Another special task he had been given was the one he was performing now, to nurture and guide a high phoenix should and when another is recognized. As Kurama examined the boy under his supervision, a tiny smile appeared on his face at that moment, followed by a half-smile. The world was going to be reminded of the Uzumaki's unwavering perseverance. Ancient torches around a terrified Uzumaki ceremonial site glowed with magnificent golden flames, old weathered swirls covered in growing greenery glowed throughout the old Uzumaki home, Uzushiogakure. What remained of the destroyed defense perimeter shone as light was bent and redirected, and for a few minutes, the presence of the destroyed village reappeared, as a faint impression of its glory showed. He paused, his head snapping in a different direction as if an invisible signal had told him to do so. His short red hair stood proudly on his head, protected from the windy elements by an aura he emitted, his grayish shirt with white trims, silver stripes running down the sides and sleeve endings in a dull but strong gold color. The collar was white, with a phoenix emblem on the front of the shirt matched by a red swirl on the back, and his black pants, which were bent because he had stopped mid-crouch. The blizzard blinded his normal vision, so he sent a tiny trickle of his power to his eyes for a special technique. The world soon changed to a different set of colors for him, with red representing heat and blue representing cold. He focused his Yuki in his eyes and looked both inside and outside the blizzard as he tried to find the signal that had called him. A minute later, he just let out a disappointed sigh, realizing that the signal had been too short and too small to pinpoint, not to mention that he had sensed a big barrier blocking the signal. Nevertheless, he quickly changed his direction to follow the general direction from which he had sensed it. The energy pulse, as small as it had been, had resonated with his own energy signature, which is likely why he had felt it in the first place. It called to his senses on a level that shouted to the core of his being, unlike many he had encountered in his long life. However, something nagged at him, a familiar feeling that was unsettlingly so, but he dismissed the strange sensation and blamed it on the unfavorable weather, shaking his head slightly in frustration. Surara walked silently but quickly, past a turn into her daughter's room. She slid one door to the side without making any noise, and her keen eyes narrowed on the source of the strange energy. She had noticed a tiny spike in Yuki, not big enough to startle anyone else in her village, before it lowered and tapered off to a ridiculously small leak. She had used her senses to trace it to the young boy she had welcomed into her home just hours earlier, and she had a sigh of relief when she saw that her daughter was sleeping peacefully, but her eyes narrowed as she eyed the boy next to her. Naruto appeared to be sound asleep despite the slight glow on his hand, which was a yellow bird-like creature surrounded by a circle. The mark on his hand reflected the energy she had been tracking, and while she kept the glow in her mind, she could hear his breathing, She worried about him as she saw his flushed face and labored breathing, but then she paused at another point. Sweat covered his face. As far as her senses could tell, Naruto was a fire-based Yukai, and if his passive energy signature was any indication, he was also very strong. Just a little had allowed him to melt her ice. Based on what she knew about fire-type Yukai, they were never too hot, just as she was never too cold as a Yuki, Ona. She put her hand aside and grabbed the bowl her daughter had used earlier in the day, which had amused her enough as she watched her daughter desperately attempt to treat what she had assumed was a fever from the boy, not realizing he was naturally warmer. She was sure it would be a funny memory one day. With hardly a thought, she cooled the water to just above freezing, dipping a finger into the bowl and swirling it in random patterns as the towel her daughter had used earlier slowly wrapped around her digit. Hee. She gently met Mizore's drowsy eyes while slowly squeezing the towel to remove extra water. "What are you doing?" From behind Naruto on her futon, her daughter inquired. As she applied the cold cloth to Naruto's forehead, Surara remarked, trying to bring down Naruto's fever deer. Her daughter sat up abruptly and said, "Hasn't he already okay?" "He didn't have a fever this morning, it just started. Observe the perspiration," she said, meeting Mizore's perplexed stare. Naruto is a Yukai of the fire type. He is inherently warmer than the majority of Yukai and us. However, he is actually too warm because he is currently perspiring. Somehow, Surara whispered to herself, taking in her mother's words quickly. She glanced and verified his perspiration, hardly paying any attention to the glowing mark on his hand. After a minute, Surara raised an eyebrow as her daughter began to fidget with her gaze fixed on Naruto's form. She then watched with curious eyes as her daughter tentatively placed a hand on Naruto's cheek, and although she remained silent, she couldn't help but let her curiosity and a hint of amusement grow as she saw Mizore weakly draw her hand back before conflicting emotions showed on her face. "Isn't it necessary to lower his temperature?" She spoke in a softer tone than usual. There was something in her words, something just out of her grasp, but I couldn't pin it down. Surara thought carefully as she considered her daughter's words and actions. "Yes," was her response. Mizore chewed her bottom lip as she fixed her gaze on Naruto, taking in his slight frown, his tense, audible breaths, and the few hairs that clung to his face from perspiration. With a great deal of surprise and shock, Surara watched as her daughter timidly crawled onto Naruto's futon and embraced him, pressing herself against his warm body with her hands. She ignored her implied feelings and forced her observations through logical reasoning, but despite her initial thoughts, the only visible reaction she had made was widening her eyes as she blinked to make sure her eyes weren't tricking her. After only 3 seconds, she had to force herself not to slap herself in the face because Yuki Ona's body was inherently cold. She allowed a gentle smile to appear on her face and gave her daughter a gentle tap on the shoulder. "If you feel overheated, don't push yourself, okay?" Mizore stutteringly said, hi, with her flushed face turned down. With a quiet chuckle, Surara refreshed the towel and sat patiently next to them until she heard her daughter's soft, lowered breathing. Unbeknownst to Mizore, Surara observed how Naruto's features gradually softened over the course of a quarter of an hour. Surara then moved into a more comfortable position and smiled softly as she observed the children sleeping in front of her, the room glowing softly from the faint moonlight coming from Mizore's room's only window. Kurama could easily claim to have one of the most developed minds in the world thanks to his artificially enhanced mind, extensive training, and many millennia of experience. He was able to work on multiple tasks at once with perfectly separate portions of his mind, delegating part of his attention to strengthen Naruto's mental defenses until he learned how to do it himself, while another part of his mind experienced the memories the boy's brains were sorting. As if doing those two tasks and occasionally directing the boy's mental processes were insufficient, Kurama had also set aside some of his attention to examine the boy's body for issues. His family had created seals that were more powerful than a god's, but even as he confirmed what had happened, he still found it difficult to believe. As it turned out, the Uzumaki memory hold contained seals that were ridiculously powerful. If he hadn't believed before, he wouldn't be able to believe now, as some of them had been absurdly so, with him sensing that the Reaper's seal binding him be altered and some portions of it completely overridden or destroyed. Recognized as one of the 9 guardians, the Uzumaki hold memory had, in essence, designated him as the boy's personal guardian angel. The altered Reaper's seal now gave him restricted access to the outside world, allowing him to leave the boy's body as he pleased, with the only limitations being any setting Naruto felt like. The new seal also gave him unrestricted access to the boy's mind, with the boy's personality, personal memories, and a vault containing implanted memories he was not aware of. Kurama sighed with exhaustion as the scan of Naruto's body came to an end. After doing as thorough and serious a scan as he could, he discovered that the years of abuse had done far more than he had anticipated. Even with his phoenix heritage unleashed, there was only so much it could do for a body that had never been properly developed in the first place. The damage had been a part of the boy's entire life, and it was horrible and normally unhealable. Natural healing would never fix it all. Although Kurama had seen and dealt with worse in his long life, the task at hand was to figure out how to work out the kinks and rusts that had settled into his techniques over centuries of inactivity. In addition to the fact that he had been deprived of his power for 8 years, only to have it all re-injected into him at once when the vault sensed his stolen supplies, his control was destroyed, not in a terrible way, but in a way that was incredibly annoying, and it would likely take him a few days before he could comfortably manage his large stores again. He closed his eyes and shifted positions, letting his mind wander inwards with an ancient tire stemming from his bones. He gradually extended his control over all of his power, gently guiding it, molding and channeling it in practiced patterns as he let himself sink into the feel of his power. His eyes snapped open before he directed his Yuki to begin healing the boy, starting with the boy's underdeveloped and malnourished body. He sent his Yuki into bones, muscles, and fat, allowing his Yuki to take hold and charge the boy's cells. He paused a few other mental tasks he had been doing and redirected more of his mental resources until a third of his mind was focused on the healing. Kurama grinned at the idea, thinking rhetorically, how many other beings can claim to only need a third of their minds to heal a person's body at this level? He wasn't just encouraging cell division and growth, either. He was doing something much more sophisticated. By giving each cell its own attention, he was able to reprogram it to do what he needed it to do, which was similar to how organs functioned. Groups of specialized tissue and cells working with other organs to keep a system functioning. But he could also alter the tasks of each unique group of cells as needed. Even for a small body, there were already tens of trillions of cells that required his attention. Even so, he felt a slight tingling as he continued to work on his tasks. Without pausing his healing, he tapped into his still, untapped mind, and with hardly any effort on his part, a mental copy of himself materialized. This was a manifestation of his mind's resources that made it easier for him to focus on different tasks. Without saying a word, the copy moved to the Naruto's sensory center to investigate, passing dozens of other copies along the way with a tiny smile of satisfied satisfaction on its face. Entering the room that symbolized the boy's sensory center, the copy only needed to sense what the boy's senses were experiencing as his smile intensified. That night, Surara wasn't the only person who saw the scene in a specific Yuki, Ona's bedroom. His senses gradually returned to him. He had a slight headache, but it only lasted a moment. He opened his eyes and saw the sparse walls of his shattered house, before his memories of the previous day returned. He smiled gratefully, but to his surprise, when he attempted to move his leg a little, he encountered resistance. His eyes immediately darted to his leg, and he felt anxious and doubtful. Then he just stared after a moment of confusion about his face passed. Why, were there limbs around his body? Naruto asked himself as he could now clearly feel 2 arms around his torso and underneath his, and at the same time he realized that there were strands of purple hair scattered all over his vision. He craned his neck to his left and eventually came into contact with Mizore's face, her hair brushing his gently and her breathing softly tickling his face. Ah, he thought drowsily, it's just Mizorist. Breathing lightly, the subtle scent of blueberries permeated his senses, and as he lay there, unthinking, it seemed like a dream to him. He was content that his own body did not twist subtly before his hands wrapped around Mizore as she did him, and his eyes slowly drifted shut before he regained some semblance of sleep. Naruto, a heavy voice said abruptly. Kurama? He asked himself abruptly. Yes, said the now recognizable voice as firmly as it had the first time. Naruto opened his mouth to speak, but he hesitated for a moment before slowly closing his lips. With a sharper mind, Naruto had come to his own conclusion and asked, You can hear my thoughts, right? Kurama said, Obviously, it also seems to me you're already reaping the benefits of a single focused mind. All right, Naruto answered. Anyway, Naruto said, raising an eyebrow, I found a few things while you were sleeping that you should be aware of. First of all, you will be able to use your mental resources as a whole because they have now been merged. Meaning exactly? Inquired Naruto. This means that your mental power was always divided between them when you had a split and blurred personality, but now it's all focused. Also, because whatever mental development you made as a child was always suppressed by the seals, your mind kept trying to develop what it thought it hadn't yet, with most of the development being constantly pushed to your real suppressed personality. So your basic mental abilities, such as the capacity to remember, are actually far more developed than the average person. Kurama compared it to carving a foundation repeatedly until anything you built on top of it would be able to be supported. He was familiar with this idea, having previously undergone a similar exercise to build up his mental capacities. Ah, Naruto uttered, unsure of how to respond. Kurama abruptly warned, aside from that, you will also want to be careful for a while. What? Naruto inquired, paying close attention. The mental repair you underwent only separated what was true and what was false. It did not combine your two personalities. Even though your true personality has been recovered, you must keep in mind that the mask that previously obscured it was made by your true mind to hide behind. Naruto asked in shock, what? So I still have split personalities? No, to put it simply, you had begun to believe that your mask was who you really were, so your mask became a new personality that competed with your original one, causing your mental abilities to be split. However, when the suppression seals were removed, your original personality was no longer hindered, and with what I suspect was healing from the Uzumaki memory hold, your mind was able to realize that your mask was just that, a mask, a manifestation and tool of the original personality, Kurama said. The guardian of Naruto stopped, and as he listened carefully in his mind, he heard what he believed to be a loud breath of air exhaling and then exhaling again. As your mind is clear now, you will be conscious of your mask when you wear it, so don't worry too much. However, you are no longer in danger of losing yourself to your mask. Your mask, no matter how you look at it, was created by you to protect you. So don't panic or become lost in confusion when you suddenly find yourself instinctively wearing a mask. Oh. As a last step, I'll be restoring your body to its former state, free from the malnourishment and abuse you endured. To aid in this process, I'll need you to consume a greater range of nutritious foods. All right, Naruto muttered uncertainly. You know, you could try asking the snow woman who took you in. Sheepishly, Naruto uttered, I forgot. Kurama's eyes softened with a glimmer of sorrow inside the seal, whereas normally he would have made a joke or at least a playful insult. Kurama remarked, it's okay. I'll be going to bed soon. I've been working all night. Sleep well, and thank you, Naruto whispered to him. A soft squeak reached his ears, followed by a sudden brush of air against his cheeks, and he opened his eyes, confused, his mind quieted again, his surroundings slowly coming back into focus. He stopped breathing, and he was no longer able to sense hers. They stared at each other in blank shock, his blue eyes looking into her purple ones, his mouth opening slightly but not making a sound, their arms still encircling each other, neither of them daring to move an inch, and for what seemed like an eternity they just stared at each other, occasionally feeling the other's light breath. Mizore then broke into a grin and said, Ohio Naruto-kun. After a thick silence, Naruto's back was pressed against the wall in less than a second. What the fuck? With a finger pointing accusingly, he cried out. She said, stifling a recoil, I was trying to keep you cool. Huh? His mask prevented him from thinking. Are you not referring to warmth? Naruto inquired. Shaking her head back and forth, Mizore said, no, I mean cool, you had a fever last night. Oh. Naruto put his hand to his forehead. Did I? Naruto was perplexed because, to the best of his memory, he had never become ill. Surara said from the door, yes, you did, Naruto, and Mizore kindly helped lower your body temperature. So that's why she had her hands around me while she slept? Naruto shook his head in response. Kurama had been correct. Although it no longer struggled to be him, it was still a part of him, a tool that his mind would automatically employ. Hold on a second. Doesn't sharing a hug keep you warm? The mask was frightening. It had taken control of him and obscured his thoughts. Despite the morning's calmness, he was able to concentrate and see the world again. We're Yuki. Ona. Although our young, like Mizore, don't develop their powers until later, we have power over ice and naturally have cooler bodies. She raised a hand to form a snowball, but her gaze briefly met Mizore's. She seemed hesitant as she added, that's also why we live in cold places like where we are now, on top of a mountain. Naruto extended a hand and waved it in the air, saying, it doesn't feel that cold. He was certain that he would have missed it if he hadn't been staring at her at that precise moment. A sinister, almost demonic, gleam that had ignited in her eyes before her typical expression took their place. A little too sweetly, she concluded, that's because you're wearing one of Mizore's insulated kimonos. Naruto's curious face flushed, and he tentatively eyed himself as if to confirm. It was mostly gray with some white patches. Naruto nodded cautiously and then looked at Mizore, whose cheeks were slightly flushed. We normally wear such clothing to keep the cold in, but it helps for your case too. Well, what about those outfits from the ski resort, Kasen? Mizore inquired. Well, there are some men's clothes there. I suppose we could go there after breakfast. Unless, Naruto, you prefer to remain dressed like her? She quickly responded with two red faces and a sputtering response. A smirk appeared on her face. Surara didn't notice her daughter's uneasy fidgeting, but Naruto nodded angrily, uncertain if his voice wouldn't betray him. Before leaving the room, Surara thought to herself, so easy to play. She reluctantly fixed her gaze on him, and as he approached the door, her thoughts began to race more quickly until she could take it no more. Mizore? She faced him while standing with her back to the door. What are you doing? She concealed her flinch as she felt his probing gaze pierce her, and for a split second, she wished he would comprehend. Masumi. When her mother's hand touched her shoulder, she instinctively touched her face and lowered her head a little. Feeling anxious, her mother knelt down and leaned forward until her mouth was directly next to hers. She was certain that her mother was plotting, so she did not like the smile that appeared on her face. Would you mind staying here, Naruto, while we go get you some clothes? Surara. Why? You'll need my sizes, too. As Mizore stood behind her mother with half of her face hidden, Naruto posed the question. Ah, that's true, but, she was stopped by a sudden tug, and she patted her daughter's head for a brief moment, ignoring her horrified and accusing gaze. Mizore stopped, making tiny fists halfway to her mother's back, and said, Mizore's embarrassed that people might realize you're in her clothes. What? Mizore's mother asked as she softly tousled her hair. His hands moved in a familiar gesture, matching his confident smile, and before Surara could ask, a tiny plume of smoke burst forth. That won't be a problem. Surara's eyes narrowed and she twitched ever so slightly before Naruto reappeared, this time wearing black pants and a gray shirt. A delusion? From him, she detected only the faintest hints of Yuki. She became intrigued. She sensed that the boy was covered in what appeared to be a diluted Yuki shell. She sensed the same kind of energy in people, but much more of it. The technique did not involve the use of fire Yuki. Surara corrected herself, a very compact shell, nope, it's solid. Mizore crept out from behind her mom and prodded. She prodded once more, and then a third time. Mizore questioned, can you turn into other things? Like a girl? He just shrugged, perplexed by her, and then made the hand signs again. A brunette of comparable height in her kimono appeared in front of Mizore, followed by a similar cloud of smoke. Who.irk? Mizore jabbed him once more, this time in the cheek. As she pulled her curious daughter back by the scruff of her neck, Surara reprimanded Light, saying, Now, that's enough. She swiftly pushed the door open and shoved the two out. Aside from the dim path that led down the little mound where their house stood, all they could see was the snowy tundra. One of the requirements for her daughter was that her home wasn't particularly close to the village. She picked up a bag outside the door, dismissing such thoughts. Surara said, Now then Naruto, do you know how to ski? No, Surara smiled and shoved a pair of ski poles into his hands, saying, We'll have to give you a crash course then. Making snow rafts was always exhausting. They worked with ease while he hummed his alarm. Before he could react, his feet were swiftly strapped to a pair of skis, and he just stared with wide eyes. Wait. I still don't know how to ski. He was already sliding due to the drastically decreased friction. He frantically attempted to stop his movement by pushing at least one ski into the ground, but all he managed to do was speed up his unsteady dance. He stopped suddenly as two smaller hands gripped his wrists and one hand steadied him by holding onto the back of his kimono. With resolute eyes, Mizore whispered, I won't let you fall. He could only return with a feeble smile in his disheveled female form. Squeezing his fingers around the ski poles once more, she left her hand on his left. Mizore had shifted to his left, her body turned sideways, and asked, Ready? If a thought hadn't come to him at that moment, he would have nodded. He saw ice quickly forming beneath her feet as his eyes darted sideways. Surara had a hander out to the ground close to Mizore's feet behind them. From behind, Surara commanded, Stay in front of me, Mizore. Her daughter nodded in response to her. He replied, Yes. Someone smiled at him. Then he was gone, leaving a high-pitched scream that suited his body. His first reaction was to flinch and close his eyes. Squeezing his hands pulled him from his panic. Naruto, eyes to the front. Before he deliberately forced himself to calm down, he became aware that his breathing was too rapid. His survival instincts quickly realized that the girl holding his hand had far more experience than he did as his surroundings raced by. Thus, without protesting, he promptly committed himself to obeying her orders as assiduously as possible. He gradually gained confidence as the seconds went by. Eventually, I was able to enjoy the experience to some extent. The cool, refreshing wind that blew past him only made him feel more amazed as he learned more details. He turned his head slightly and studied Mizore's focused expression. However, the occasional gentle nudges he felt from her hand to change their direction didn't fit the description of someone who was anxious or even in a panic. He closed his eyes and submerged himself for a short time. Surara chuckled quietly to herself behind them. She snickered softly, thinking that maybe she would have been a better teacher. Mizore didn't have the same level of experience, but she could confidently say that her daughter could handle snowboarding. When they abruptly drove off, it was clear that Mizore had misjudged how much of a drag Naruto would be. Her daughter was too preoccupied with Naruto, and her eyes suddenly locked on the path ahead of them in terror. She started to remind her daughter, but her words turned into a shout. Although Surara had noticed her daughter's head turn slightly toward the bump, Mizore had assumed it was just a small snow bump because she had focused most of her attention on Naruto. It wasn't. Mizore, Naruto said, turning his head. Her snowboard had been punctured by the protruding rock, which caused it to break into multiple pieces of ice. In an instant, he released the ski pole and switched his left hand's grip. When Surara said, "Naruto, watch your front," his head swung to the front. His eyes then grew wide. A big, flattish rock with a slight upward curvature was rapidly approaching. His veins were racing with blood, and he leapt with a single, decisive motion. All of this took place before Surara could catch up to them. After landing on the rock, Naruto was propelled upward by his momentum. Naruto turned as a result of Mizore's added weight. Mizore's terrified hands fumbled for a grip as she was lifted into the air. Naruto paused in the middle of an inadvertent spin to observe Mizore in flight. Her terrified expression instantly caused his thoughts to race at 100 miles per hour. He let go of the other ski pole in his right hand and took Mizore's, his face hardening quickly. His skis returned to the snowy ground as the additional load he had grabbed slowed his spin just enough to correct his direction. The remainder of Mizore's body fell onto his back a second later. Even though Surara had found the feat to be amazing and magical, there was still an issue. Naruto was not only inexperienced, but he also lost control after losing both of his ski poles. She was still rushing blood from her cooling panic, her arms and legs coiled tightly around him. Her eyes snapped back into focus when Naruto called. She raised a hand instinctively, but her blood froze. She wasn't meant to possess her abilities just yet. She wondered if she should show off her abilities. And let him go? No, however, if she didn't. She sighed in gratitude. She had been saved by her mother. She let her hand drop in relief as her agonizing thoughts came to an end. Her mother's lethal ice claws quickly chopped down the obstacles in their way. Her heart relaxed slowly. She relaxed her tight hold and leaned into Naruto, who was holding her up by her thighs. Mizore no longer cared that Naruto had lost control of his transformation technique at some point during the disaster. They had taken a much longer route around the main village, avoiding it completely because of their little exciting adventure. She could easily pass it off as assisting her mother with her work, just taking care of a human customer. Even if Naruto was later spotted with her at their ski resort, nothing would be questioned. Mizore, wake up. She gave the girl a gentle shake and muttered something stupid. Naruto said it again. Mizore. The pain in his arms and feet had soon become apparent after the adrenaline rush had subsided. She said, opening her eyes drowsily. Awareness reluctantly returned to her, saying, "We're at the ski resort." But he's so at ease that her eyes popped up. Where did that idea originate? Her training began 3 seconds later. With caution, she climbed off Naruto, putting any more thoughts of that nature to rest. She muttered, "Thank you." Naruto hesitated. He had never experienced gratitude before. What should he do? He smiled awkwardly back. It wasn't a problem. It had been at least a full minute and there had been no response. Naruto experienced a brief wave of anxiety. Had he done something incorrectly? Naruto gave himself a mental slap, raising his voice uncertainly at the last moment. It was fun." Mizore was about to blurt out 100 apologies when he stammered. Naruto stared silently for a moment before a broad smile appeared on his face. I had fun too." Then he burst out laughing. Ah. Mizore's hand tightened around him to prevent him from slipping any farther. He reached down and gave her a sheepish but appreciative smile. With a sudden sense of urgency, he struggled to free himself from the straps that held him to the skis. He was also frightened by the fun, as evidenced by his trembling fingers. Mizore glanced around before giving her mother a silent thank you. No one else was visible, and they were at the rear entrance. Surara was leading workers away past the door with a variety of directives and explanations. He led him into the resort, slipping her hand into his, avoiding both customers and employees as covertly as possible. She was too preoccupied with staying undetected to notice the thoughts on Naruto's face. Initially, it had been curiosity as she dragged him along while casting a suspicious glance around. Sometimes she had nudged him behind walls, and other times they had ducked behind furniture. He then concluded that it was akin to a game, and he had been nearly invisible thanks to his practiced stealth techniques. Even though they were holding hands, he was fairly certain that multiple people had given Mizore curious looks, but they never seemed to notice him. He glanced at the sign and said, "Here. A changing room?" Then a blush snuck up on him again, and he remembered why he had come. He became uncomfortably aware of his clothing. How the fabric brushed against him with each movement he made. Even the soft material's soft touch on his chest while he breathed became intolerably awkward. He was relieved that she had pushed him into the changing room sooner rather than later, as it had forced him to stop thinking about his upsetting thoughts. She then gave him some clothes. He reached for the sash out of instinct, but stopped when he remembered something. He briefly raised his eyes, and his face flushed. He looked up again, shuffling his feet nervously. Her expression had been bewildered and somewhat worried. He swallowed, trying to suppress his fluttering feelings. "Mizore, could you leave?" he asked, forcing himself to look her in the eye as his blush grew more intense. Her face turning red all of a sudden didn't help either. He saw her hurry out the door and shut it behind her. His fingertips gave a little jolt as they tentatively reached for the sash once more. His heart was racing and his hands were trembling once more, but this time it wasn't due to fear or adrenaline. Every drag and touch of her kimono was felt and accentuated, making him uncomfortable as he undressed. The Yuki. Ona on the other side of the door, who was furiously burning, had only been made aware of his awkwardness by the noises he made. It had only been a minor argument, a little squabble. He and Mizore had only exchanged a few words about her cooking that were hardly spiteful. Naruto didn't really think the cause was justified because it had been so foolish. Back away. He swung the chair at them once more, managing to hold them at bay for a brief moment. He had no idea that Mizore's culinary skills were so poor. He realized now that he had foolishly denied her story of a purple blob with tentacles, which had seemed far too similar to a fairy tale. "How is this even possible?" he exclaimed, leaping onto the table and grabbing one of Mizore's hands. They had been encircled from all sides by the yellow mushrooms. Perhaps he ought to have heeded Sarera's dozen warnings a little more. However, he had foolishly disregarded Sarera's persistent insistence that traditional Yuki Ona dishes and Mizore's culinary prowess were incompatible. It's true that some of the Yuki in traditional Yuki Ona dishes was infused into the ingredients, particularly the ice, but the cooking was so poor that the Yuki in those ingredients were able to come alive. That really shouldn't have been possible. He didn't want to know what would happen if they touched his skin, leaving a trail of yellow ice in their wake. But every second that passed, they got closer, and his wish got less realistic. With their backs to one another, Mizore was pressed close to him. They were both equally terrified of the hideous creatures that Mizore's cooking had produced. If more than those somehow caught fire, he hoped Surara would understand that he only had one resort left. His two hands ignited with a mental command. He shot flames as small as he could, or as small as he would allow himself, against the yellow monstrosities with as much accuracy as he could. Surara had been teaching Mizore how to control the internal flow of Yuki on the third day he had been with the Shirayuki. She claimed that this would make it simpler for Mizore to control ice when her powers developed. He had inquired eagerly if he could join and perhaps make his own ice. Surara had allowed him to participate in her lesson, despite his disappointment at being told he couldn't make ice. They had found that he was a quick learner. After only an hour of practice, he had unintentionally set himself on fire. His mask came back on during that brief panic, and he began to run around screaming, just like his old self. However, it was soon stopped by a layer of snow. Die. By this point, at least half of them had been burned, and nothing had burned, which was good. In an attempt to protect him, Mizore had already put her hands around him. However, he found it strange that Mizore was completely incapable of using her abilities. Although Surara had stated that Yuki Onas develop their powers as they get older, she believed that she would already have some power developed. The fact that he had experienced it himself was even more perplexing. He felt as though he could sense their power, though he was unable to articulate it clearly. He would sense Sarera's use of her powers a second before they occurred. He had experienced similar patterns from Mizore on several occasions, but each time either nothing happened or Sarera's presence was the reason. He turned back to the other half of the yellow rodents. They were already seated at the table. It makes sense why Mizore seemed to be attempting to merge with him. Burn! He hissed angrily, focusing on the final dozen. He could hear the music in their gurgled screams. In an attempt to assist Mizore, he had offered Surara his observations. With a smile, Surara brushed it off, explaining that although he might have been a natural Yuki sensor, he might have easily picked up false signals due to his lack of training. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that Surara was concealing something. Something about the way she had expressed it just didn't sit well with him. He turned to face the familiar voice, But the girl behind him shoved him flat onto the table. Duck. He shivered as 4 lethal pieces of ice whistled past where he had been just a moment before. Less than a foot from him, he followed their paths and discovered 4 of the yellow monstrosities pierced and adhered to the table. He would risk anything to get those yellow things to him, even if it meant getting stabbed. Well, smirked Surara. Naruto lowered his shoulders. If only he had acknowledged that 15 minutes earlier. Fine, I admit. Mizore's cooking is plain horrible and scary. Sensing a glare, he turned his head slightly and made a firm face toward Mizore. He did not even twitch his face in response to her pout. Her shoulders followed his lead 10 seconds later. The 2 women stared at Naruto incredulously when he said, "So, about dinner," before following his lead and searching the kitchen for anything untouched by Mizore's cooking. Amazingly, Naruto's cooking attempts had remained unharmed despite the yellow ice and goo that covered everything. However, that raised a concerning query. Why?
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.